Hello friends of the friends who watch. My videos are not subscribed, and I would be really happy if you do so. Also, don't forget to hit the like button and leave your comments, your interaction. I know how this is gonna sound. I bought a haunted McLaren off the dark web. Yet. But trust me, I'm not some weirdo who spends all day on shady forums looking for freaky stuff to blow my money on. I'm just a regular dude. My name is Alex. I'm 33, single, and I work from home as an IT consultant. I live in a decent apartment. Love pizza way too much. It's a miracle I'm not shaped like a pizza slice, and I have a normal, boring life. My point is, I'm not some reckless thrill seeker. I just have a thing for cars, especially the ones that are so expensive. They're basically spaceships with wheels. McLarens, for example, I could never afford them in a million years. Or so I thought. Let me backtrack a little. My McLaren obsession started when I was a kid. I had this little die-cast McLaren FM model that I got for Christmas one year. I'd spend hours on the floor, just staring at it, imagining I was tearing up the streets of Monaco or Tokyo like some Formula One badass. Fast forward to adulthood, and the dream never really died. I knew I'd never the kind of cash to buy something that insane. I mean, my 2008 Corolla, Bessie, is still chilling in my parking lot. But a guy can dream, right? Anyway, this whole mess started because of some random Reddit thread. I was slacking off at work, scrolling through cars, and someone posted a picture of a McLaren 720s they spotted in London. Naturally, the comments were full of people arguing about whether it was worth the price, how it compared to Lambos, and all that jazz. But then, one guy mentioned something bizarre. He said there was this cursed McLaren floating around on the dark web. Apparently, everyone who owned it ended up dying in some seriously messed up way. Now, not really the superstitious type. I grew up Catholic, sure, but I haven't exactly been to church lately, let's put it that way. Still, the idea was too ridiculous to ignore. I mean, a cursed supercar. That's the kind of thing you see in those cheesy Netflix horror flicks. Naturally, I did the most logical thing, I Googled it. Nothing came up on the regular web, obviously. But I was curious enough to dust off my old Tor browser, fire up DuckDuckGo, and dive into the sketchy underbelly of the internet. I know. What do you even have Tor installed, Alex? Look, let's just say I've dabbled in a little crypto trading, and not all coins are exactly mainstream, okay? But I digress. After a bit of digging through forums and shady marketplace links that would probably give my computer as I found it, the listing. The title was straightforward. McLaren 720s, cursed. Previous owner 2 TCs. BTC only. Yeah, you read that right. 25 grand for a car that costs like a $300 new. That was practically waving in my face like a giant neon warning sign. The description was short and sweet. Lightly used McLaren 720s orange. 235 miles on the odometer. Vehicle history available upon request. Warning: this vehicle is reportedly cursed by its first owner. All subsequent owners have suffered untimely deaths. Serious inquiries only. Delivery included. Non-refundable. Seller not responsible for accidents or injuries. Bitcoin payment required. Now, I'm not proud of what I did next, but hear me out. I've always considered myself lucky, like freakishly lucky. I've won raffles I didn't even know I entered. I've avoided car accidents by seconds. I once found $500 in an old coat pocket that I have zero memory of putting there. So, in my head, I figure if anyone could break this stupid curse, it's me. The seller didn't even bother hiding their email. They straight up listed it in the ad. I shot them a message through some encrypted email account I'd set up for, online purchases. Don't judge me. The reply came back almost instantly. Send BTC to this address. Delivery in 3-5 business days. No further questions will be answered. Sketchy, right? But dozen 5,000 for McLaren. It was just too good to pass up, curse or no curse. Besides, if it turned out to be a scam, I could just write it off as a lesson learned. So, I transferred the Bitcoin, closed my laptop, and tried to forget about the whole thing. 3 days later, a car carrier truck put up in front of my apartment building. I swear I almost fainted when I saw it. It was real. Bright, orange, pristine condition, not a scratch on it. The delivery guy didn't even ask for a signature. He just unloaded the key fob and left without a word. The first thing I did was check the VN. It matched the listing. It was all legit. The mileage, the specs, everything was as advertised. The only thing off was this faint smell coming from inside. Not bad, just off. Like burnt plastic mixed with old leather. That night, I went through the glove box and found an envelope labeled Owner History. I wasn't expecting much, but what I found inside still gives me the chills. It sounds unsettling to say the least. There were 4 names list, each followed by a date of death. Ethan Hayes, September 14th, 2018. Olivia Grant, March 2, 2019. Michael Davis, August 26, 2019. Samuel Jonas, December 15th, 2021. No explanations in detail, just names and dates. I googled every single one of them. Turns out they were all real people, and each of them had died in some freak accident. Ethan was hit by a falling tree during a storm. Olivia had a heart attack while jogging at 32. Michael drowned in his own pool, even though he was an experienced swimmer. And Samuel, well, his was the weirdest of all. He died in his sleep, but the cause of death was listed as undetermined. I should have stopped there. I should have called the cops, or a priest, or literally anyone. But instead, I grabbed the key fob, hopped into the driver's seat, and took it for a spin. And that's when things started getting really weird. Okay, so the first time I sat in McLaren, it felt surreal. This thing screamed luxury. The buttery leather seats, the sleek digital dashboard, the way the steering wheel fit perfectly in my hands. For a guy whose car experience peaked with Bessie, my trusty old Corolla, and a beat-up Honda Civic I had in college, this like stepping into a spaceship. But as soon as I pressed the start button, something felt off. The engine roared to life, but the sound wasn't quite right. It wasn't the smooth throat growl I expected from a car like this. It sounded rough, kind of like it hadn't been driven in years. I brushed it off as nerves. After all, I'd never driven a supercar before. It was probably just imagining things. I decided to take it for a spin around my neighborhood, just to see how it felt. Nothing crazy, just a few laps to get a feel for the power. The car handled like a dream, obviously. Smooth acceleration, tight steering, and brakes that could probably stop time itself. But about 10 minutes in, I noticed something weird. The car's built, and GPS had switched on by itself. Now, I know these cars are loaded with fancy tech, so I figured maybe I accidentally bumped something. But the screen wasn't showing my current location. Instead, it displayed an address it had recognized in 62 Hollow Pine Road. I didn't think much of it at first. Maybe the previous owner had programmed it in, or maybe it was just a glitch. But when I tried to turn it off, the screen froze. Then, the weirdest thing happened. The voice navigation kicked. Turn left at Maple Drive. I hadn't even entered a destination, but the car was acting like it wanted me to follow this route. I laughed it off, thinking it was some kind of software bug. but I couldn't shake the feeling that was tensional. Still, I was curious. Hollow Pine Road wasn't far from where I lived, maybe a 20-minute drive. It was one of those rural roads just outside of town, lined with old farmhouses and fields stretched for miles. I figured it couldn't hurt to check it out. If nothing else, it'd make for a cool story to tell my buddies. As I drove, I noticed the GPS didn't give me the option to reroute or cancel. Every time I tried to mess with it, the screen would glitch like it was overriding me. I'm not proud to admit it, but I started talking to the car. "All right, car," I said. "What's your deal? You taking me to some secret McLaren owner club or what?" The joke felt hollow. By the time I reached the outskirts of town, the road started getting narrower. The streetlights disappeared, and the pavement turned to gravel. I realized I hadn't seen another car in at least 10 minutes, which weird Friday night. Even weirder, my signal had completely dropped. I tried refreshing Instagram just to check, but nothing loaded. Finally, I saw a sign, Hollow Pine Road, 1 mile ahead. I hesitated. I wasn't stupid. I knew this whole thing sounded like the start of a bad horror movie. But I told myself it was just a harmless glitch, or maybe some leftover setting from the car's previous owner. So, like an idiot, I kept driving. When I reached Hollow Pine Road, it was pitch black. No houses, no streetlights, just a narrow road surrounded by thick trees. The GPS showed a single blinking dot at the end of the road, like it was marking some kind of destination. I slowed down, rolling the car forward at a crawl. Then, the smell hit me. It was faint at first, like something burning in the distance. Not wood, though, plastic. It reminded me of that weird smell I'd noticed earlier inside the car, but stronger. I checked the vents, thinking maybe the air conditioning was acting up, but they were fine. The GPS screen flipped. Again this time, a new message popped up. "You have arrived." The dot on the map was gone. I stopped the car in the middle of the road, staring at the screen like an idiot. There was nothing around me but trees and shadows, yet the car acting like I'd reached some kind of destination. I rolled down the window, half expecting to hear crickets or wind or something. But it was dead silent. That's when I noticed the engine was still idling. Only it didn't sound like an engine anymore. The rough grow from earlier had returned, but now it was uneven, almost like it was struggling to run. I swear it sounded like breathing. I tried turning the car off, but the start-stop button wasn't responding. The lights on the dash flickered, and for a split second, I could have sworn I saw something flash across the rear-view camera. A shadow, a figure, I don't know. It was too fast to make out. And then the radio turned on. I hadn't touched it, and yet it was blasting static at full volume. I frantically turned the knob, trying to lower it, but it didn't budge. Then, through the static, I heard something. A voice. It disfigured, like it was coming from far away. But I could make out a single word. Leave. I didn't need to be told twice. I threw the car into reverse and floored it, kicking up dirt as I sped back down Hollow Pine Road. The smell got stronger, filling the cabin like the car itself was burning from the inside. By the time I made it back to paved roads, the radio had gone silent, and the GPS had reset itself. It was like nothing had happened. When I pulled into my driveway, I sat there for a minute, just staring at the dashboard. Everything was back to normal. No weird smells, no strange noises, no cryptic BS roads. I told myself it was all in my head, just a mix of nerves and my overactive imagination. But as I got out of the car, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. There were handprints on the windshield. Not on the inside, on the outside, and they definitely weren't mine. I didn't sleep that night. Not because I was scared. At least, that's what I told myself. But because I needed answers. The handprints on the windshield. I had zero explanation for that. And frankly, I didn't want one. All I knew was that something wasn't adding up. I did what a rational person would do. 2 a.m., I grabbed my laptop and started digging. I already knew about the 4 previous owners from the envelope in the glove box. But I hadn't really looked deeply into their lives. I figure there really was some connection between them and the car. It had to be buried somewhere online. I started with the first name, Ethan Hayes. Ethan was the guy who originally bought McLaren new back in 2018. According to the articles I found, he was a young hotshot hedge fund manager in New York City. Wealthy, successful, the kind of guy who probably bought a $300,000 car, like I'd buy a pair of sneakers. The news about his death was straightforward. He was crushed by a tree during a freak storm while driving the McLaren. Tragic, sure, but not exactly supernatural. Then I moved on to Olivia Grant, the second owner. She bought the car in early 2019 and barely had it 6 months before her death. The articles were vague, just saying she collapsed while jogging in a local park. But as I read further, I found a small detail that made me pause. The McLaren was parked in the lot where she'd been running. Witnesses said she'd arrived, sat in the car for about 15 minutes, and then started her jog. Next was Michael Davis, the third owner. His death was more unusual. He was found drowned in his own pool. But what struck me was that my neighbors reported seeing the McLaren idling before anyone noticed something was wrong. No one ever explained why the car was running or who turned it on. Finally, there was Samuel Jones, the most recent owner before me. Samuel's death had baffled medical examiners. It was undetermined, which basically means they couldn't figure out why a healthy 29-year-old just didn't wake up one morning. I couldn't find much about his connection to the car, except for one detail buried in a forum thread. Apparently, Samuel had tried to sell the McLaren weeks before he died. He posted it on a luxury car marketplace, practically begging someone to take it off his hands. He even dropped the price to $10,000, insanely low for a car like that. One commenter asked him why he was selling it so cheap, and Samuel replied with just 2 words. "It's cursed." That word, cursed, kept popping up everywhere I looked. People on car forums, Reddit threads, even a random YouTube video about haunted objects. Everyone seemed to have some version of the same story. The McLaren brought bad luck. Owners got sick. Accidents happened. Weird stuff started piling up. And yet, every time the car changed hands, someone else would buy it. Why? Because no one could resist the deal. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the glowing screen of my laptop. I was starting to feel like an idiot. I mean, I didn't believe in curses. At least, not really. But the coincidences were stacking up, and I couldn't ignore them anymore. I decided it was to reach out to someone who might actually know what was going on. Using the email address from the original dark web listing, I sent the seller another message. "I need to know the truth about this car. What's wrong with it? Why are owners dead?" To my surprise, they replied almost immediately, "You bought it. It's your problem now. Don't contact me again." Helpful, right? By now, I was running out of options. I thought about calling the police, but was I supposed to tell them, "Hey, I bought a car wet now. I think it's cursed"? Yeah, that would go over great. Besides, the car was legally mine. I had the title, the registration, the whole deal. It wasn't like I could just return it. Then I remembered something. Then I was reading about Ethan Hayes, the first owner. I came across a mention of a charity event he'd attended a few months before his death. It was some high-profile gala in Manhattan where he'd showcased the McLaren as part of a silent auction. One of the articles mentioned he'd gotten the car customized for the event, adding a bunch of personal touches to make it stand out. Maybe whatever was wrong with the car started there. I started looking for the customization shop he'd used, and after about an hour I found it. Ifality Customs, a boutique auto shop based in New Jersey. They specialized in high-end cars, and according to their Instagram page, they'd done work for everyone from pro athletes to actors. I figured it was a long shot, but I decided to call them the next morning. When I finally got through to someone, I didn't mention the curse or the deaths. I just said I'd recently bought a McLaren 720s that they worked on back in team or wanted to know about the customizations. The guy on the phone paused for a second, then said, "Oh yeah, I remember that one, right? Ethan's car. The orange one." "Yeah, that's the one," I said. "Man, that car was weird," he said. He wanted all this creepy custom stuff. Black suit interior, some engraving on the steering wheel, and a freaking. He trailed off, like he wasn't sure if he should keep going. "A freaking what?" I pressed. The guy hesitated again, then said, "A lockbox. A lock-a-box. We installed it in the trunk." He was super specific about it. Said it had to be airtight, fireproof, bolted down. No idea what he put in there, though. A lockbox. My stomach sank as I realized I hadn't evened the trunk since the car arrived. After I hung up, I grabbed the keys and headed outside. The McLaren was sitting in my driveway, gleaming in the morning sunlight like nothing had happened the night before. I opened the trunk. It was a small, black lockbox tucked into a custom compartment. The lock was one of those heavy-duty combination types, the kind you'd see on a bank safe. I tried lifting the box, but it wouldn't budge. It was wooden down just like the guy said. I had no idea what was inside or why Ethan felt the need to keep it locked up so securely. But I knew one thing for sure. Whatever was in that box might be the key to understanding what was really going on with this car. I didn't open the lockbox right away. To be honest, I wasn't even sure how to start. The combination lock looked industrial grade, and without the code, I'd probably need heavy tools to break it open. Not exactly something I'd lying around my apartment. Still, just leaving it alone didn't sit well with me. After pacing around my living room for half an hour, I decided to take the straightforward approach. I grabbed my phone, sat down at my desk, and started. Again, I figured Ethan Hayes was paranoid enough to install a custom lockbox in his McLaren. Maybe he left a clue somewhere. Rich people love their secrets, but they also love leaving breadcrumbs for someone to find. I searched through every public Reddit I could find on eFind, old interviews, social media posts, even comments he'd left on random articles. Nothing about a combination. But then, I stumbled onto a post on his old Instagram account. It was from 2018, a few months before his death. The post showed the McLaren parked outside what looked like a countryside mansion. The caption read, "Masterpiece deserves the perfect safe haven. 914, home sweet home." At first, I didn't think much of it, but then hit me that'd be the combination. I grabbed my jacket and headed back outside to the car. The morning sunlight made everything feel less ominous, almost like the events of the previous night were a bad dream, but the lockbox of the trunk was all too real. I turned the dials on the combination lock. 914. The lock clicked open. Now, here's where things got weird. I expected to find something expensive or incriminating inside. Jewelry, cash, maybe even documents that then didn't want anyone else to see. Instead, I found something completely unexpected. A stack of old, weathered photographs. There were maybe 10 or 12 photos in total, all of them black and white, and they looked like been taken decades ago. Most of them showed the same thing, an old stone building surrounded by trees. It looked abandoned, with broken windows and ivy crawling up the walls. The building didn't ring any bells, but there was something written on the back of each photo: coordinates. I didn't even need to think twice. I ran back inside, pulled up Google Maps, and plugged in the first set of coordinates. They pointed to a location about 100 miles away from me, out in the middle of nowhere. I tried the rest of the coordinates, and they all pointed to the same spot. What was this place? Why did Ethan have these photos? And why go through all the trouble of locking them away in a custom box? By now, my curiosity had completely taken over. I told myself I'd just drive out there, take a quick look, and come right back. Worst case scenario, it was some kind of prank or a leftover project from Ethan's life. Best case scenario, it might help me understand what's going on with the car. The drive took about 2 hours, and the closer I got to the coordinates, the more rural the area became. Paved roads turned to gravel, then to dirt, until I was surrounded by nothing but fields and forest. I passed a few old houses along the way, but most of them looked abandoned. No cell service, no other cars, just me and the McLaren cutting through the wilderness. When I finally reached the location, I almost missed it. The stone building from the photos was hidden in behind a thick wall of trees, barely visible from the road. I parked the car on the shoulder and made my way through the underbrush, my heart pounding with a mix of excitement and unease. The building looked even worse in person. Time had been kind to it. Half the roof had caved in, and the walls were covered in graffiti and moss. The front door was missing entirely, and the inside was dark and empty, save for a few broken pieces of furniture scattered around. I spent about 20 minutes exploring, but nothing stood out. It was just an old, crumbling building in the middle of nowhere. I was starting to feel like I'd wasted my time until I saw this spot carved into one of the walls. It was faint, bare visible beneath the layers of dirt and graffiti, but I could make out a series of numbers scratched it into the stone. 9/14/18, Ethan's date of death. I stared at the numbers, trying to make sense of it. Had Ethan been here before? Did this place have something to do with his death? And why had he hidden photos of it in the car's lockbox? As I turned to leave, I noticed something else. A small metal plate embedded in the floor near the center of the building. It was about the size of a shoebox, and it looked like it had been bolted down long ago. My first thought was that it might be some kind of time capsule or hidden compartment, but I had no tools to open it. Frustrated, I made a note of the location and decided to head back home. Whatever was going on, I needed more information before I could go any further. The drive back felt different. The McLaren handled just as smoothly as before, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it knew I'd found something. The GPS stayed off, the dashboard lights didn't flicker. I felt like I wasn't alone in the car. I parked in my driveway, locked the car, and went straight to my laptop. This time, I started searching for any connections between Ethan Hayes, Ethan visited. Took a while, but eventually, I found a link. The stone building used to be part of an old sanitarium that shut down in the 1950s. It was one of those places with a shady history, rumors of mistreatment, illegal experiments, all the usual stuff. Over the years, the property had been sold off and abandoned, leaving only the crumbling shell I'd visited. But here's the kicker. Ethan's great-uncle used to work there. I couldn't find much about the guy, other that he'd been one of the head doctors at the sanitarium before it closed. But that one detail raised a million new questions. Why was Ethan keeping photos of the place? What was his connection to it? And more importantly, what did that have to do with the car? I didn't have the answers yet. I was starting to get the sense that I was in way over my head. I barely slept that night. It wasn't fear keeping me up. Exactly. It was the overwhelming feeling that I was close to putting all the pieces together. The sanitarium, Ethan's Greykall, the lockbox. It all had to mean something. I just didn't know what. By the time the sun came up, I'd made a decision. I was going back to the stone building. This time, I wasn't going blind. I packed a flashlight, a crowbar, and a small toolkit I'd borrowed from my neighbor Bob. Bob's one of those retired handyman types who never asks questions. So, when I told him I needed to fix something on my car, he just nodded and handed me the tools. The drive back to the building was uneventful, though I couldn't shake the feeling that the McLaren wasn't entirely under my control. It drove perfectly, but the steering felt heavy, like it was subtly guiding me. I kept telling myself I was imagining things, but by the time I reached the dirt road leading to the building, my hands were practically glued to the wheel. When I got there, the place looked exactly as I'd left it. Quiet, empty, forgotten. I parked the car on the side of the road again and made my way back through the underbrush. The morning air was crisp, and the sunlight filtering through the trees gave the whole scene almost peaceful vibe. Wasn't fooled. Something about this place felt wrong. Once inside, I headed straight for the metal plate I'd found the day before. It was still there, bolted into the floor like a tiny vault. I dropped to my knees and got to work with the crowbar, prying at the edges until the bolts finally gave way. What I found underneath wasn't what I expected. It wasn't a time capsule or a box of hidden treasures. It was a small, sealed jar. Glass, about the size of a mason jar, but with some kind of black wax around the lid. There was something inside, but the glass was too fogged up to see clearly. The moment I touched the jar, a strange, almost metallic smell filled the air. It wasn't strong, just faint enough to notice, but it made me hesitate there. I thought about leaving there, but I knew I couldn't. Whatever this was, it had to be connected to the car and to Ethan. I slipped the jar into my backpack and hurried back to the McLaren. The second I got in, the dashboard lit up like a Christmas tree. The GPS had been quiet since we left the city limits, suddenly came to life. But instead of showing a route, the screen was blank except for a single message. Return it. I stared at the screen, my hands gripping the wheel. Return what? I muttered under my breath. Of course there was no answer, but deep down, I knew exactly what it meant. The jar. I didn't know where to return it or why it was so important, but I couldn't ignore the message. I pulled out my phone, opened Google Maps, and started searching for anything that might give me a clue. That's when I saw it. A cemetery about 10 miles from the sanitarium. The cemetery's name, Hollow Pine Cemetery. I don't know why I hadn't made the connection before. The road, the building, the photos. It all led back to this. The drive to the cemetery was tense. Even though nothing unusual happened, I half expected the car to start acting up again. But the McLaren was silent, almost like it wanted me to go there. When I pulled into the gravel lot, the place was completely empty. No visitors, no groundskeepers, just rows of old, weathered headstones stretching out in every direction. I grabbed the jar from my backpack and stepped out of the car. The air felt heavier here, like the ground itself was holding its breath. I wandered through the rows of graves, looking for, well, I wasn't sure what I was looking for. A sign, a name, anything. And then, I saw it. A headstone near the back of the cemetery, partially hidden by overgrown grass. The name etched in the singed shells through Mayor Dr. Leonard Hayes, Ethan's great-uncle. The dates on the headstone matched the timeline of the sanitarium. Daughter. Hayes had died in 1952, right around the time the facility shut down. But it wasn't the name or the dates that caught my attention. It was the small, circular indentation at the base of the headstone. It was the exact same size as the jar. I knelt down, hesitating for just a moment before placing the jar into the indentation. For a second, nothing happened. The cemetery was as still and silent as before. But as I stood up, I noticed the smell. The faint, metallic scent I'd first noticed back in the building. It was gone. It was like the air had cleared. I didn't stick around to see if anything else would happen. I got back in McLaren, turned the key, and drove away without looking back. The car didn't fight me this time. The GPS stayed off, the engine purred smoothly, and for the first time since I bought it, the interior felt normal. When I got home, I parked the McLaren in the garage and locked it. I haven't driven it since. That night, I did one last search on Ethan Hayes. I wanted to know why he'd gone through so much trouble to hide the jar, and why he'd kept photos of the sanitarium in the first place. That's when I found a single sentence buried in an old article about the sanitarium's closure. Rumors persist that Dr. Leonard Hayes conducted unsanctioned experiments on patients, including attempts to bring consciousness to objects. I don't know if the rumors are true. I don't even know if the jar was connected to the car in the way I think it was. But here's what I do know, that the McLaren hasn't acted up since I returned the jar. It's just a car now. Fast, beautiful, and completely ordinary. I'd like to think the curse is broken, but I'm not taking any chances. The car is up for sale, listed well below market value. And if you're wondering if it's still cursed, well, that's for the next owner to find out. A lot of you are asking for the link to the listing. Sorry, I'm not sharing it. Let's just say you're better off not getting involved. This is where I get off this crazy ride. You have been warned. Alright, so before you go judging me for being reckless, I just need to explain where my head was at. I'm not some idiot who jumps on sketchy deals or thinks the dark web is a playground for curious people. I know better than that. Or at least, I thought I did. But when you're staring at the screen of your laptop late at night, and you see a deal so good it feels like destiny, well, you start to make some really dumb decisions. Let me back up. My name's Alex, and I've been obsessed with cars for as long as I can remember. I'm not just talking about posters of Lamborghinis or a plain need for speed as a kid. I'm talking about real obsession. I follow every car page on Instagram. I watch every new review on YouTube, and I know the specs of just about every exotic car out there. Problem is, I've never been able to afford any of them. I work a decent 9 to 5 at an insurance company. You're not buying a Ferrari on a mid-level salary, you know. So about 3 weeks ago, I was messing around online, trying to see if I could find any hidden gem deals on used sports cars. It started innocent enough: Craigslist, Facebook Marketplace, the usual places. But everything was either overpriced or completely trashed. That's when I remembered something a guy at work, Mark, told me a few months ago. He was into conspiracy theories, always going on the dark web, saying you could buy anything there, fake passports, stolen electronics, even cars. At first, I brushed it off, but the thought stuck in my head. What if there were real deals out there? Like cars being sold under the table? I mean, sure, it's probably stolen stuff, but how would anyone trace it back to me? I'm just the buyer. So, curiosity, no desperation, got the better of me, and I downloaded Tor. For those of you who don't know, Tor is a browser that lets you access the dark web. You can't just Google stuff like dark web car sales. Obviously, you need special cognition. Links, which I found by poking around on forums. Most of the links were dead or led to sketchy websites selling stunts of like counterfeit IDs or hacked Netflix accounts, wandering through a virtual flea market of illegal junk. And then I found the site. It was called Prime Rides Direct. Yeah, super generic name, but the homepage had pictures of luxury cars, all listed for a fraction of their real value. Ferraris, Lambos, even a Bugatti. Most of them were going for the price of a used Toyota Corolla. It felt too good to be true, but it didn't have the usual scammy vibe. There were detailed descriptions, mileage, VIN numbers, and even reviews that satisfied customers. I figured the site was probably selling stolen cars, and that's why they were so cheap. But here's the thing, I didn't care. This wasn't about morality. This was about me getting the car of my dreams for a price I actually afford. One car, in particular, caught my eye, a red 2017 Ferrari 488 GTB, listed for $12,000. For reference, this car is worth around $200,000. I clicked on it, and there was a full page of photos. It was immaculate. No scratches, no dents, and only 9,000 miles on the odometer. The description said it was a private sale, and delivery was included in the price. That should have been my first red flag, right? But I was too caught up in the fantasy of owning a Ferrari. The payment method was Bitcoin, which, of course, added to the sketchiness. I didn't own any crypto, so I had to spend the next couple of hours setting up a wallet and figuring out how to convert my money. It was a pain, but eventually, I transferred the DADAs and got a confirmation email. The email was super professional, which made me feel a little better. It said my car would arrive within 3 days and gave me a tracking link. The site even had customer service. I emailed them just to test it, asking a question about the paperweight work, and they responded within an hour, saying the tide would be included with the car. Looking back, that was probably fake reassurance to make me feel safe. The next 2 days were the longest of my life. I didn't tell anyone what I'd done, not even my brother Chris, who's usually my go-to for everything. I knew he'd freak out and tell me I was being an idiot. So I kept it to myself and tried to act normal, even though I could barely focus on anything. I kept refreshing the tracking link like it was Christ Eve, and I was waiting for Santa. Then on the third day, it just showed up. I don't even know how they got it onto my street without anyone noticing. I live in a pretty quiet suburb, and the sight of a riot fear right off the bat, marked truck isn't exactly subtle. The delivery guy didn't even knock on my door. By the time I opened it, the car was just sitting in my driveway, with a folder on the driver's seat labeled Documents. I mean, perfect. The paint glistened in the sunlight, the leather interior smelled new, and the engine purred when I turned the key. The folder had a title, registration papers, and even a bill of sale. All of it looked legit. For the first time in my life, I felt like one. But, as you probably guessed by now, the high didn't last long. The first sign of trouble came that night. I just parked the car in my garage and locked up for the night. My cut for block number. I normally don't and answer those, but something told me I should. This Alex? A deep voice asked. Yeah. Who's this? This is Detective Miller with the state police. We need to speak to you regarding a recent purchase you made. I froze. How the hells did they know? Before I could respond, the line went dead. That's when I noticed the second thing, the folder. I hadn't paid much attention to it after taking the papers out, but now, under the dim light of my kitchen, I saw something sticking out of the bottom. A photograph. I pulled it out, and my stomach dropped. It was a picture of the Ferrari, parked in a driveway, but it wasn't my driveway. It was someone else's, and standing next to the car was a man. His face was circled in red marker, with the word Ramavith scrawled underneath. I didn't sleep that night. I mean, every creak of the house settling, every car driving past, made me jump. I felt like someone was about to kick down my door. But no one came, and by the time the sun came up, I was just sitting at my kitchen table, staring at the photo. My coffee had gone cold, and my hands were shaking. I'm not the kind of person who deals with the police much. I've never been in trouble anything more than a parking ticket. But the blocked call from the detective was eating at me. If the cops already knew about the car, how long until they came banging on my door? And what was I supposed to say? Well, yeah, I bought a Ferrari on the dark web for 12 grand, and I have no idea what's going on. That's not gonna fly. I decided I needed a lawyer. Now, hiring a lawyer isn't exactly something I know how to do. It's not like you can just Google lawyer for suspicious Ferrari purchases, right? But I did my best. I searched for criminal defense attorneys in my area and found one with decent reviews. His name was Andrew Lawson, and his office was about 20 minutes away from me. I called him as soon as his office opened. Andrew Lawson's office. A receptionist answered. Hey, I need to speak to Mr. Lawson. It's kind of an urgent legal matter, I said, trying not to sound like a lunatic. What kind of legal matter? It's about a purchase I made. I think it might involve stolen property. I really need help. There was a long pause before she said, Hold on, let me see if he's available. A couple of minutes later, Andrew himself got on the line. His voice was calm, professional. So, you're saying you purchased something that might be stolen, he asked. I said. But it's not just that. There are weird circumstances around it. I got a call from a detective, and I don't know what's going on, but I think I'm in trouble. Okay? He said. Why don't you come into my office? Bring any paperwork or documentation you have about the purchase, and we'll figure this out. I booked an appointment for the afternoon, spent the rest of the morning gathering everything I had. The folder from the car, the email receipt, screenshots of the website, even the Bitcoin transaction confirmation. I also printed out the photo I'd found in the folder, though I wasn't sure if I should show it to him yet. When I got to Andrew's office, I was a nervous wreck. He had one of those typical small town law officer chairs, framed diplomas on the wall, a coffee machine that looked like it hadn't been cleaned in years. Andrew himself was in mid-40s, shaven with that kind of, trust me, I've seen worse vibe. So, tell me everything, he said, motioning for me to sit. I laid it all out for him, the dark web, the car, the delivery, the blocked call. I didn't tell him about the photo yet. I wasn't sure how he'd react to that. When I was done, he leaned back in his chair, tapping pen against his desk. All right, he said. First things first. Yes, you're in a bad situation, but it's not hopeless. The fact that you came to me before the police showed up is a good thing. It shows you're being proactive. What do I do? I asked. Well, the first question is whether the car is stolen. If it is, that's a problem. But the fact that you didn't know it was stolen could work in your favor. That's called lack of intent. You didn't knowingly buy a stolen vehicle, so the charges would be less severe, if there are any charges at all. I nodded, though it didn't make me feel much better. The second issue, he continued, is the paperwork. You said the title and registration came with the car. Yeah, I said, pulling them out of the folder. He examined them for a moment, frowning. These look legit, but they could be forged. I'll need to run the VIN number to make sure the title and isn't flagged in any databases. What about the detective who called me? I asked. Why would he already know about the car? That's the part I'm not sure about, Andrew admitted. The police are already looking at you. It might mean the car is linked to a bigger investigation. You might just be collateral damage. Collateral damage? Look, I don't want to scare you, but sometimes stolen property, especially high-value items like cars, can be tied to organized crime. If that's the case, the police might see you as a lead, even if you're innocent. My stomach dropped. Here's what I'm going to do, Andrew said, sliding the paperwork back to me. Run the V number and check for any red flags. In the meantime, you need to lay low. Don't drive the car, don't post anything about it online, and don't answer any calls from blocked numbers. If the police contact you again, call me immediately. Do not speak to them without me present. Got it? Yeah, I said, swallowing hard. As I was getting ready to leave, I hesitated. There's one more thing, I said, pulling out the photo. Andrew looked at it for a long time. His expression didn't change, but I could tell he didn't like what he was seeing. Where did you find this? He asked. It was in the folder with the documents. This changes things, he said, sliding the photo into a file folder. I'll need to hold on to this for now. If this man is the previous owner of the car, and if he's missing, the police might suspect you had something to do with it, you didn't, right? Of course not, I said. Good. Then we'll get ahead of this. But I need you to tell me everything. No secrets, no surprises. If you leave something out, and it comes up later, it'll look bad. Understand? Yeah, I get it. All right, go home, and I'll call you as soon as I know more. Driving back, I couldn't stop thinking about what Andrew had said. Organized crime, stolen property, missing people. What the hell had I gotten myself into? When I pulled into my driveway, I noticed something strange. The garage door was open. I was 100% sure I'd closed it before I left. When I saw my garage door wide open, I froze in the driver's seat. My trust, though, that someone had broken in, maybe trying to steal the Ferrari. But when I peeked inside, nothing seemed out of place. The car was still there, parked exactly where I left it. I checked the locks on the house, too. Everything was intact. At this point, I didn't know if I was being paranoid or if something was genuinely off. Andrew's warning about laying low kept ringing in my head, so I closed the garage, locked up the house, and tried to stay calm. I told myself it was probably nothing. Maybe I'd hit the button on the remote accidentally. That night, I got another call. This time, the number wasn't blocked. Alex, this is Detective Miller. I believe we spoke briefly before. The voice said. It was the same guy who'd called me before, but this time he didn't hang up. I felt a lump forming in my throat, but I forced myself to stay calm. Yeah, what's this about? I need to meet with you in person, he said. This isn't something we can discuss over the phone. My stomach sank. Am I in trouble? Not if you cooperate, he said. You're not looking at you as a suspect. You're more of a key witness, and we need your help. That didn't make me feel much better, but I agreed to meet him the next morning at diner about 15 minutes from my house. Andrew had told me to call him if the police reached out again, so I immediately shot him a text and explained the situation. He called me back within minutes. "Ari deal," Andrew said. "Go to the meeting, but don't say anything that could implicate you. If they try to pressure you into something, let me know right away. And don't sign anything without me." The next morning, I showed up at the diner. It was one of those old school places with booths and a long counter. The kind of place where the waitresses still call you honey. Detective Miller was already there, sitting in a corner booth with a cup of coffee. He was in his 50s with salt and pepper hair and a no-nonsense demeanor. "Thanks for coming," he said, motioning for me to sit. "Yeah, sure," I said, sliding into the booth across from him. He didn't waste any time. "The car you purchased is part of an ongoing investigation. We believe it's connected to a larger criminal operation, one involving theft, money laundering, and possibly worse." I swallowed hard. "Okay, but I didn't know that when I bought it. I didn't meet anyone in person, it just showed up at my house." "We know," he said. "That's why we're not looking to arrest you. You're not the first person to get caught up in this scheme. These guys are running underground network, moving stolen cars through the dark web. They're using people like you, buyers who don't ask too many questions, as a way to clean the goods." "So, what happens next?" I asked. "This is where you come in," he said, leaning forward. "We need to catch these guys in the act, and you're in a unique position to help us do that. Since you've already made contact with them, we want you to make another purchase, Daw." "Another purchase?" I said, my voice rising. You serious? You want me to go back to the dark web and buy another car? Do you know how sketchy that is?" "I understand your hesitation," Owen said, his tone firm. "But this is our best shot at shutting them down. We'll provide the money for the purchase, and we'll monitor the traction every step of the way. You won't be alone in this." I sat back, trying to process what he was saying. This wasn't just about me anymore. These guys were running a full-blown operation, and if I didn't help, someone else might get caught in the same mess. Or worse. "Do I have a choice?" I asked. Owen sighed. "Technically, yes. But if you refuse, you're going to be under a lot more scrutiny. This way, we can protect you. You help us, we help you. Simple as that." I knew Andrew would probably tell me not to agree to anything without him, but in that moment, I felt like I didn't have a choice. "Fine, I'll do it," I said. "Good," Owen said, sliding a small folder across the table. "Here's how it's going to work. We've set up a Bitcoin wallet for you with the funds you'll need. You'll go back to the same site, find another car, and initiate the purchase. Once the transaction is complete, we'll step in and track the delivery." "And what happens when the car shows up?" I asked. "We'll take it from there," he said. "Our goal is to intercept the delivery and catch whoever running this operation." The whole thing felt like something out of a bad cop drama. I mean, how was this my life now? But I nodded and took the folder, which contained detailed instructions on how to proceed. When I got home, I called Andrew to let him know what had happened. He wasn't thrilled about the idea of me working with the police, but he agreed that it might be my best option. "Just be careful," he said. "These guys are dangerous, and if the police screw this up, you're the one who's going to be stuck in the middle." That night, I logged back on Tor and returned to the site. It looked the same as before, with rows of luxury cars listed for ridiculously low prices. This time, I didn't feel the same excitement I had the first time around. Now it felt like I was walking into a trap. After scrolling for a while, I settled on a black Lamborghini Huracan. It was listed for the $15,000, and the description said it was lightly used, with only 12,000 miles. I followed the police's instructions, transferring the Bitcoin and confirming the purchase. The email confirmation came through almost immediately, just like last time. It said the car would arrive in 3 days. Now, all I could do was wait. But as the days passed, something started to feel off. The tracking link they gave me didn't work this time. And then on the second day, I got another email. Not from the site, but from a random, encrypted address. It was a single line of text. You don't know who you're dealing with. When I saw the email with the line, you don't know who you're dealing with, my heart sank. It wasn't like the other emails I'd gotten during this whole ordeal. There was no logo, no professional formatting, just a single sentence in plain text, sent from an address that looked like it had been scrambled by some kind of encryption software. I immediately forwarded the email to Detective Miller and called it to let know what had happened. Did you respond to the email? He asked, his tone sharper than usual. No, of course not. Should I have? He said quickly. Good, we'll look into it. For now, stick to the plan. But the thing was, the plan didn't feel as solid anymore. The tracking link for the Lamborghini still wasn't working, and the lack of updates was driving me insane. Every time I tried to ask Miller for an update, he told me to sit tight, let them handle it. And the time the third day rolled around, I was a nervous wreck. The first car, the Ferrari, had shown up like clockwork. But this time there was nothing. No delivery truck, no folder, no signs that the car was even coming. I stayed glued to my window all day waiting for something, but the driveway stayed empty. Around 8:00 p.m., my phone buzzed. It was Miller. Alex, we've got something, he said, not bothering with any kind of greeting. The car isn't coming to your house. What do you mean? I asked. The delivery routes changed. They must have figured out we were monitoring the transaction. Our tech team traced the vehicle to a warehouse on the outskirts of the city. We're moving in tonight. Wait, what? What about me? You've done your part, he said. Stay home and let us handle this. We've got a team on the ground. I wanted to feel relieved, but something about the whole situation felt wrong. If the criminals behind this operation knew the police were watching, why would they risk using the same warehouse? It felt too easy, like they were setting a trap of their own. Still, I wasn't about to argue with Miller. I stayed home, pacing around my living room, trying to distract myself. I was halfway through scrolling my Instagram feed when my phone buzzed again this time. It was a text. They're using you. It was from the same encrypted number that had sent the email the day before. My hand started shaking as I stared at the screen. How did they know my number? How to what was happening? I called Miller again, but he didn't pick up. It went straight to voicemail. I just got another message, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. Call me back when you get this. I hung up and sat there, staring at my phone, waiting for response. Nothing. An hour passed, then 2. I tried calling Miller again, but still no answer. Finally, I got tired of waiting and decided to call Andrew instead. If anyone could make sense of this, it was him. "Well, X going on?" he asked as soon as he picked up. I explained everything: the email, the text, the sudden change in the delivery route. Andrew was silent for a moment, and I could almost hear him thinking through the situation. "Look, I don't like this," he said finally. "If they've changed the route, it means they're on to you. And if they're on to you, they're on to the police. This isn't just a sting anymore, it's a chess game. And right now, you're a pawn."
Who'd ask?
"What am I supposed to do?" I asked. "Stayed put," he said. "Let the police handle it. If something goes sideways, you don't want to be anywhere near it." I nodded, even though he couldn't see me. "Okay, I'll wait." But I didn't have to wait long. Around midnight, my phone rang again. This time it wasn't a blocked number or an encrypted message. It was Miller. "We need you to come to the station," he said, his voice tight. "What? Why?" "I'll explain when you get here. Just get here now." I didn't like the sound of that, but I grabbed my keys and drove to the police station. When I walked in, Miller was waiting for me in the lobby. He looked tired, not just physically, but mentally, like the weight of the night had finally caught up to him. "What's going?" I asked. "The warehouse was a bust," he said, running a hand through his hair. "We moved in, but it was empty. No cars, no people, nothing. Just an empty building." "So, what does that mean?" "It means they played us," he said, his voice full of frustration. "They knew we were coming. They must have abandoned the location days ago, and now they're in the wind." I felt a sinking feeling in my chest. "So that's it. They're just gone." "Not exactly," Owen said. "We found something in the warehouse. A message." He handed me a photo, and my stomach dropped. It was a picture of me, sitting in my living room. It had clearly been taken through the window of my house, and scrawled across the bottom in red marker were the words, "Assistez PD" at the photo. My mind racing. "What does this mean?" "It means you're not just a witness anymore," Owen said. "You're a target." When Miller showed me the photo of myself sitting in my living room, I felt my stomach twist into a knot. Someone had been watching me. Someone had been close enough to take that picture and leave it behind as a warning. And now, I was at the center of this whole mess. "Do you have any idea who took this?" I asked, barely able to keep my voice steady. Miller shook his head. "We're working on tracing it back, but these guys don't leave much of a trail. This photo is their way of telling us to back off. They're spooked we're getting clone, but it also means they're desperate and dangerous." "Great," I muttered. "So now I've got a bunch of criminals who think I'm the reason their operation is falling apart." "Listen," Miller said, lowering his voice. "We're going to put you in protective custody for a while, just until we figure out our next move." "Protective custody," I repeated. "What does that even mean? Am I just supposed to disappear from my life, my job, my house?" "For now, yes," he said. "This isn't optional, Alex. These people know where you live. They've already been there. If you stay, you're putting yourself and anyone close to you in danger." I didn't argue. I knew he was right, but that didn't make it any easier to accept. The next couple of hours were a blur. Miller had an officer drive me home to grab a few essentials, but I wasn't allowed to stay long. As I packed, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. Every shadow outside the window, every passing car, it all felt wrong. By the time I was taken to the safe house, I was completely drained. It wasn't anything fancy, just a small, nondescript apartment on the other side of town. It had basic furniture, blackout curtains, and a Wi-Fi connection that barely worked. The police posted someone outside to keep watch, but other than that, it was completely alone. For the next few days, I did nothing but wait. No work, no social media, no contact with anyone except Miller and Andrew. I wasn't even allowed to tell my family where I was. The isolation was suffocating, but it was better than the alternative. Finally, on the fourth day, Miller called with an update. "We found the cars," he said. "Wait, what?" I sat up on the couch, nearly dropping my phone. They moved the inventory to another warehouse, but this time we caught a break. One of our undercover officers managed to intercept a shipment. The cars were being prepped for transport overseas. "That's good, right? It's a step in the right direction," Miller said. "We've identified a few key players in the operation, and we're closing in on the person running the whole thing. But there's something else you need to know." "What is it?" "There's the evidence that suggests these guys aren't just dealing in stolen cars," he said carefully. "They're involved in a larger criminal network, fraud, identity theft, and they've been using the dark web to recruit unsuspecting by launder profits. That's why they've been so meticulous about covering their tracks." I felt like the floor was falling out from under me. "So, what does this mean for me? Am I still in danger?" "For now, yes," Miller admitted. "But we're keeping a close eye on things. The good news is your cooperation has given us a lot of leverage. If this goes to trial, your testimony could be the key to taking them down." That wasn't exactly comforting, but at least it felt like we were making progress. For the next few weeks, things started to quiet down. The safe house became my new normal, and I slowly adjusted to the idea of living under police protection. I kept in touch with Andrew, who assured me that I wasn't facing any legal trouble as long as I kept cooperating. "You'll be fine," he said. "Just hang in there." But then, just when I thought things were settling down, I got one final email. It came late to the same empty address as before. This time, it wasn't a warning. It was a simple question. Was it worth it? I stared at the screen for a long time, unsure how to respond, or if I even should. The question was haunting, though. Was it worth it? That car, chasing a dream, worth everything I'd been through? Looking back now, I know the answer. It wasn't. The Ferrari was impounded, of course. And I never saw it again. I'm still working with police as they wrap up their investigation, but I've done my best to move on with my life. The whole experience taught me a hard lesson about greed and temptation, and about how the things that seem too good to be true almost always are. If you're listening to this, take my advice. Stay away from the dark web. Don't let desperation, curiosity pull you into something you don't understand. Because once you're in, getting out isn't as easy as clicking log off. As for me, I'm trying to rebuild. I sold my old car and used the money to buy something safe and boring, a used Honda Accord. It's not flashy, and it's definitely not a Ferrari. But it gets me where I need to go. And honestly, that's all I really need. I don't know why I'm even writing this. Maybe it's a way to feel like I still exist. Maybe it's because I think anyone, might stumble across this and figure out what to do. Or maybe I just need to get it out of my head before it drives me insane. Either way, if you're reading this, I need you to know this isn't some clickbait creepypasta, and it's not some dramatized urban legend. It's my life, my reality. A few years ago, I've completely lost track of how long it's been. I was broke. I mean, scraping pennies together just to get McDonald's from McGonner minimum kind of broke. My job at the time wasn't cutting it, and I was barely making rent for my shoebox apartment in Chicago. To make things worse, my student loans had gone into default, and the emails and phone calls from debt collectors were relentless. The stress was unbearable. I felt stuck, like was no way out. One night, after mindlessly scrolling through Reddit and half-heartedly Googling ways to make quick cash online, I came across a post in a forum I wasn't even sure how I ended up in. The title was too simple. Arbien Tour participating in a psychological isolation study. The post itself didn't have much detail, which probably should have been a red flag. It just mentioned that the study was being conducted as part of an experiment on long-term sensory deprivation and social isolation. There was a link at the bottom, some sketchy-looking onion URL. At first, I rolled my eyes and kept scrolling. But after about 15 minutes, I found myself staring at my empty bank balance and thinking, what could happen? I downloaded the Tor browser, something I'd only heard about from true crime YouTube channels and Reddit threads about the dark web. It felt strange using it, like I was stepping into a world I wasn't to know existed. The interface itself wasn't that weird, just a stripped-down version of a regular browser. But the sites, they were on another level. Markets selling, let's just say, the legal stuff. Forums filled with conspiracy theories and other things I honestly didn't want to know existed. I typed in the onion link from the post and hit enter. The site that loaded wasn't as dramatic as I'd expected. It had a plain black background with white text and a logo that looked like a generic medical research emblem, something like you'd see on a pharmaceutical company's website. There was a short blurb about the experiment, followed by a questionnaire. I hesitated, my hands hovering over the keyboard. This wasn't some goofy BuzzFeed "what kind of pizza" quiz. This was asking for real personal information. My name, weight, height, medical history, and even psychological stuff like, have you ever experienced symptoms of depression or anxiety? How often do you interact with other people a day? It felt intrusive, but again, the promise of $250,000 was hard to ignore. I convinced myself it was just a research group looking for data. Maybe they'd already recruited the participants they needed, and I'd never even hear back from them. Worst case scenario, I'd get a weird spam email or two. I filled it out. 2 days later, I got an email. It wasn't from the onion link, but it was equally shady looking. The subject line was selected. It congratulated me for being chosen as one of the candidates for the study. Attached was a massive document, a contract with dozens of pages that I skimmed more than read. It outlined the conditions of the experiment, including the length of isolation, anywhere from 6 months to 2 years, depending on how well I performed, the payment schedule, and a legal disclaimer that the company was not liable for any emotional or psychological distress during the study. There were other weird clauses too, like agreeing not to disclose the study to anyone, even after it ended, and a requirement to surrender all personal belongings, including my phone, wallet, and anything that could be used for communication. I don't know why I wasn't more skeptical. The money blinded me. $250,000, that would wipe out my debt, let me start over, and maybe even buy a decent place to live. It sounded like freedom, and at the time, freedom was all I wanted. After I signed the contract electronically, things moved fast. I got another email a day later with instructions to meet at a hotel in the middle of nowhere, some roadside chain in Wisconsin. They didn't say why the location was so remote, but I figured it was just part of keeping the study secretive. When I arrived, a man in a plain black suit was waiting in the lobby. He looked unremarkable, early 40s, short hair, thin glasses, but there was something about him that felt off. He barely spoke, just nodded when I told him my name, handed me an envelope, and motioned for me to follow him outside to a nondescript white van parked out front. Inside the envelope was a single sheet of paper, was a sin of instructions. Do not bring any personal items. Follow all instructions given to you. The experiment will begin upon your arrival at the facility. I didn't even get a chance to ask questions. As soon as I climbed into the van, the guy closed the door, collided the driver's seat, and started driving the ride. Took hours. At first, I tried to make conversation, asking where the guy things like, "Where's the facility? And how long is the drive?" He didn't answer. After a while, I gave up and just stared out the window. The further we drove, the more isolated we became. The suburbs gave way to empty highways and then forests. Eventually, we turned onto a dirt road that seemed to go on forever. When the van finally stopped, it was in front of a massive, windowless building surrounded by a tall metal fence. There were no signs, no logos, just concrete walls and barbed wire. I thought about backing out. I really did. But the man in the suit was already opening the door, motioning for me to get out, and I felt like it was too late to turn back. Once inside, I was greeted by a woman in scrubs who introduced herself as Dr. Lily. She had the kind of overly polite tone you hear from flight attendants, the kind that feels rehearsed. She handed me a hospital gown and told me to change. My street clothes were placed in a plastic bag, which I assumed they'd keep somewhere safe for me. After that, they walked me down a long, sterile hallway lined with doors, each one identical to the next. The place was eerily quiet. No buzzing lights, no faint chatter from other people, just silence. They led me to a small room at the end of the hall. It wasn't much larger than a walk-in closet. There was a bed bolted to the floor, a metal toilet in the corner, and a single fluorescent light overhead. "This will be your living space for duration of experiment," Dr. Lee said, her voice calm and detached. I remember laughing nervously and saying, "It's a little bare, don't you think?" She didn't laugh back. "You'll have everything you need provided to you," she said. "We'll monitor your vitals and mental state remotely. Food and water will be delivered through the slot in the door. You'll be free to sleep, exercise, or do whatever you like within the confines of this room." "And if I want to leave?" I asked. She didn't answer. Instead, she stepped out, and the door closed behind her with a heavy clang. That was the last time I saw another human being. The first thing you need to know is that time doesn't mean anything. Isolation. The fluorescent light above me didn't dim, didn't flicker, didn't turn off. It was always on, always buzzing faintly, not loud enough to be distracting, but just enough to remind me it was there. They didn't give me a clock, anything to measure the hours, so had to rely on meals to keep track of the passing days. The meals arrived through a small slot near the bottom of the door. I'd hear a soft, metallic scrape, and there it was, a plastic tray with food. Nothing special, usually just some kind of protein bar, a bottle of water, and occasionally a cup of something hot that might have been soup. It was enough to keep me alive, but never enough to feel satisfied. I always felt hungry. There was no schedule to it either. I couldn't predict when next meal would come. Sometimes it felt like days passed before I'd hear the scrape of the slot, and other times I'd barely finish eating before another tray arrived. It messed with my head. I couldn't tell if they were keep me disoriented on purpose, or if they were just careless. At first, I thought I'd be fine. I tried to make the most of it. The room wasn't much, but I figured I'd use the time to think. I made mental lists of everything I'd do with the money once the experiment was over. Pay off my loans, buy a decent car, maybe even travel. I'd never been outside the US before, but the idea of walking through the streets of Tokyo or sitting in a cafe in Paris kept me going. But that optimism didn't last long. After a while, my brain started to crave stimulation. There was nothing to do. No books, no TV, no phone. Nothing to occupy my mind except my own thoughts. I tried exercising to keep myself busy. Push, sit-ups, pacing the length of the room. But there's only so much you can do in a space that's small. I even started counting the tiles on the floor and ceiling, just to have something to focus on. There were 32 on the ceiling, 46 on the floor. I counted them over and over, as if they might suddenly change. The worst part, though, was the silence. It was so absolute that I started hearing things that weren't there. A faint hum, like an engine idling somewhere far away. Clicking sounds, like someone tapping a pen against a desk. Once I swore I heard a woman's voice whisper my name. I knew it wasn't real. I told myself it wasn't real, but that didn't stop my brain from playing tricks on me. The first time I tried talking to someone, it went through the door. I thought, maybe they were just waiting for me to initiate contact. Maybe this was part of the test. Hello, I said, my voice cracking from lack of use. No answer. Hey, I know someone's out there. Can you hear me? Silence. I tried banging on the door with my fists, thinking that might get their attention. The metal was cold and unyielding, and after a while, my hands started to ache. But I didn't care. I just wanted to hear something. I don't care about the money anymore. I shouted. You can keep me out. Just let nothing. That was when I realized this wasn't what I thought it was. I'd signed up for a controlled experiment, a scientific study with doctors and researchers who'd monitor me, ask me questions, and collect data. I figured be regular check-ins, some kind of human interaction, even if it was just through a speaker. But no one spoke to me. No one came into the room. It was like they'd locked me in and forgotten I existed. I didn't understand. This wasn't in the tract, or at least not in the parts I actually read. Was this some kind of test to see how I'd react to being ignored? Or had something gone wrong on their end? For a while, I clung to the hope that someone was watching me. Maybe there were cameras hidden in the walls or ceiling. Maybe the experiment was designed to push me to my limits, and they were waiting to see how far I'd go before cracking. But if they were watching, why didn't they respond when I spoke? Why didn't they stop me when I tried clawing at the edges of the door, leaving shallow scratches in the paint? That hope started to fade. Eventually, I stopped talking altogether. What was the point? My throat was dry, my voice hoarse, and no one was listening anyway. I stopped pacing, stopped exercising, stopped counting tiles. There was no point to any of it. I lay on the bed for what felt like days, staring up at the ceiling. The light never dimmed, never flickered. It was always there, buzzing faintly, an endless reminder that time was moving forward. If I wasn't. Sometimes, I thought about my family. I hadn't told them about the experiment. They didn't even know where I was. I hadn't seen my parents in years, not since they retired and moved to Florida. And my friends, well, the few I had left wouldn't have noticed my absence. I'd pushed most of them away when things started falling apart in my life. Would anyone even notice if I never came back? At some point, days or weeks stopped trying to keep track of time. I made a decision. If no one was going to come for me, then I'd figure out a way to get out myself. I started examining every inch of the room, looking for weak spots. I checked the edges of the door, ran my fingers along the walls, and even pried at the corners of the ceiling tiles. Nothing. Everything was solid, seamless. It was like the room had been designed to be inescapable. But then, I found something. It was small, barely noticeable, but in one corner of them, where the wall met the floor, there was a faint crack. It was so thin that I almost missed it. I knelt down and pressed my ear to it, hoping to hear something on the other side. Nothing. But it was the first real sign that the room wasn't as impenetrable as it seemed. I didn't know what was going to do with that crack, or how long it would take to make it bigger, but it was enough to give me a small sliver of hope. And in that moment, hope was all I had left. I don't know how long I spent obsessing over that crack. It became my entire focus, my reason to keep moving. Every time a meal came through the slot, I'd save the tray and try to think of ways to use it. The plastic wasn't strong, but it was hard enough to scrape against the wall. I started using the corner of the tray to dig the crack, widening it little by little. At first, it felt pointless. The walls were solid, reinforced with something harder than just plain drywall. But when I pressed my ear to the crack again, I thought I'd feel the faintest draft. It was cold, like there was a larger space on the other side. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep me going. The digging became my ritual. I didn't care about the mess. Flakes of paint, bits of plaster, and even dust filled the room as I chipped away at the wall. I used my nails when the tray wasn't enough, ignoring the discomfort because it didn't matter. I'd never been good at building things, but breaking them, that I could manage. The monotony of it all was broken one day, if I can even call it day, by something unexpected. I was sitting on the bed, staring at the scratch marks I'd made on the wall, when I heard a loud CLNK. It wasn't the usual scrape of the food slot. And it wasn't coming from my door. It was coming from somewhere outside the room. I froze, straining to hear more. There was another sound, faint but distinct, like something metallic being dragged across the floor. It lasted for about 30 seconds before it stopped. For the first time in what felt like forever, I felt a sense of anticipation mixed with fear. But it wasn't comforting. It didn't sound like footsteps or voices, just that metallic, dragging noise. I pressed my ear to the wall with the crack, hoping to hear something on the other side, but the sound was gone. Was this part of the experiment? Were they trying to mess with me to see how I'd react? Or was it just my imagination, my brain playing tricks on me again? I didn't know, and that was the worst part. I kept digging. It wasn't until much later, again I have no idea how long, that I made real progress. The crack had widened to about the size of a quarter, and I could finally see through it, just barely. I had to crouch down and press my face to the floor to get the right hole, and when I did, I saw something. It was a corridor, long and dimly lit, with walls the same sterile white as my room. It stretched in both directions, disappearing into shadows at either end. But there was no movement, no people, no sign of anyone at all. The emptiness should have been comforting. It meant no one was watching me, at least not from that side. But it wasn't. It felt wrong, like I'd uncovered something I wasn't supposed to see. I tried whispering through the crack, just to see if anyone might hear me. Hello? Is anyone there? Nothing. I kept working, mining the hole as much as I could. My hands were raw by this point, the edges of my nails cracked and filthy, but I didn't care. I was determined to get out, even if it meant crawling through the narrow opening like some kind of rat. The more I dug, the more I thought about the silence. It wasn't just in my room. It was everywhere. If this was supposed to be a research facility, where were the people? The staff? The other participants? The air in the corridor seemed stale, like it hadn't been disturbed in years. What kind of place was this? One day or night, who knows? I stopped digging long enough to examine the food trays again. I'd been saving them, stacking them under the bed, like they might come in handy later. I don't know why I hadn't done it before, but I started snapping pieces off the trays, trying to fashion something sharper. That was when I realized something odd. The trays were all identical, same shape, same size, same cheap plastic, but the numbers stamped on the bottom were different. Each tray had a set of numbers etched into it, like a serial code. At first, I thought it was just a manufacturing detail, something meaningless. But then I started comparing them, lining them up side by side. Random. The numbers followed a sequence like they were counting up. It started with something like 125, and each tray that came after was slight higher, 126, 27, and so on. I don't know why it bothered me so much. It was just a number, right? But something about it felt deliberate, like someone, somewhere, was keeping track of every single tray they sent me. What I couldn't figure out was why. If they'd forgotten about me, if this experiment had ended and they'd left me here by accident, then why were the meals still coming? And why were they numbered so precisely? It made me think about the metallic sound I'd heard earlier. If there was no one in the facility, then who or what was delivering the trays? I didn't want to think about it too much. The idea that I might not be alone, that something might be moving through those corridors, was more terrifying than the isolation itself. I tried to focus on the crack in the wall, but the questions wouldn't leave me alone. Who was behind this? Was it even a research experiment at all? Or had I signed up for something much worse? I didn't have answers. All I had was a growing sense that whatever this place was, it wasn't what they'd promised. That night, or whatever passed for night in this endless fluorescent, hell, I finally made the hole big enough to squeeze my hand through. It was a tight fit, and the edges of the hole scratched at my skin, but I didn't care. I reached for the round blindly, hoping to find, I don't even know what, a handle, a latch, something to open the wall from the other side. My fingers brushed against something cold and hard. It was metal with grooves that felt like wheels. No, not wheels. It felt more like tracks, like the kind you'd find on a drawer or a sliding door. I pushed, pulled, and twisted, but nothing moved. Whatever it was fixed in place. And then I heard again, the metallic dragging noise. It was louder this time, closer. The metallic dragging noise was closer this time. I froze, crouched near the hole, holding my breath like that would somehow make me invisible. It wasn't loud, just a faint, rhythmic scraping. But in the absolute silence of that place, it felt deafening. I pressed my face against the crack in the wall, trying to see into the corridor, but the angle was too tight. All I could see was the same empty stretch of hallway. The sound echoed, bouncing off the walls, making it impossible to tell where it was coming from or how close it actually was. Was something moving out there? I tried to tell myself it didn't matter. Whether it was a person, a machine, or just my imagination, I wasn't going to stop now. After a few minutes, the sound faded into the distance again, leaving me with nothing but the hum of the fluorescent light overhead. I turned my attention back to the hole. My hand had grazed something metal on the other side, rails or tracks maybe, but I couldn't figure out what they were for. My fingers were too big to maneuver properly in such a tight space, so I tore off another piece of the food tray and used it like a tool, poking around blindly. Something shifted. It was subtle. Just a small click followed by a soft vibration in the wall. I froze, waiting for some kind of response, an alarm, a voice, anything, but nothing happened. The wall was still. The silence remained. I pulled my hand out and pressed my eye to the hole again. This time, I noticed something I hadn't seen before. A faint line running vertically down the wall on the other side, almost like the seam of a hidden door. My heart raced as I crouched lower, trying to get a better view. It wasn't just a seam. There was something embedded in the wall near it, something rectangular, thinly illuminated. A keypad. So, this wasn't just a blank corridor after all. There was more to this place, and it was hidden behind that wall. The discovery lit a fire under me. For the first time in what felt like months, I felt like I was making progress. The experiment isolation, the silence, didn't care anymore. My focus was entirely on that keypad and the hidden door behind it. The problem was I had no idea how to open it. I tried forcing the hole wider, but the metal underneath was too solid to break through. I thought about shouting, banging on the walls again, but I'd already done that before with no response. Whatever was happening here, whoever had designed this place, they weren't coming for me. I was on my own. And that's when the food trays. At first, I dismissed them as some meaningless manufacturing detail, but now I wasn't so sure. If the trays were being delivered by some kind of automated system, it would make sense for them to have tracking numbers. And if there was a keypad on the other side of the wall, maybe, just maybe, the numbers were a code. I pulled the trays out from under the bed and laid them out on the floor, arranging them in order. There were dozens of them, and I wasn't sure how many digits code would be. 6. More. I decided to start simple. The most recent tray had the number L182 stamped on the bottom. So, I crouched by the hole and whispered the numbers softly to myself, as if saying them out loud would somehow make the door respond. 182. Nothing again. The time with the tray number that came before it, that Searlars and an 81. But the result was the same. The door didn't budge. For hours, or maybe it was days. I worked my way through every combination I could think of. I tried reversing the numbers, combining them together, anything that might make sense. But nothing worked. The keypad remained stubbornly unresponsive. By the time I was done, the floor was littered with broken pieces of plastic from the trays. My hands were raw and my throat ached from muttering the numbers over and over again. That sense of hope I'd felt earlier, it was gone. I was sitting on the floor, staring at the trays like they might somehow reveal answer to me, when I heard the metallic sound again. This time, it wasn't faint or distant. It was close, right outside my door. I froze, my eyes locked on the food slot. For the first time since I'd been in that room, I felt genuinely afraid. Not because I thought something was coming for me, but because I realized I didn't want to know what was on the other side of that door. The sound stopped, replaced by a sharp click. A tray slid through the slot just like always. But this time, something was different. There was no food on the tray. Instead, there was a small, black object, flat, rectangular, and smooth to the touch. It looked like a keycard, the kind you'd use to access a hotel room. I stared at it for a long time, turning it over in my hands. There were no markings on it, no indication of what it was for or why it had been sent to me. But I did need an explanation. The keypad. I scrambled back to the hole in the wall and slid the card through, using the edge of the tray to guide it. My fingers shook as I tried to maneuver it into place, and for a moment, I thought I might drop it. But eventually, I managed to slide it into the keypad slot. There was a soft beep, followed by a low, mechanical hum. The hidden door shifted slightly, just enough for me to see a sliver of darkness on the other side. It wasn't fully open. The mechanism must have been jammed, or maybe it was never meant to be opened manually. But I didn't care. I pushed against it with all my strength, ignoring the way the edges dug into my palms, until the gap was wide enough for me to crawl through. The corridor was colder than I expected. The air smelled stale, like it hadn't been circulated in a long time. I stood there for a moment, disordered by the sudden change in my surroundings. The hallway stretched out in both directions, just like I'd seen through the crack in the wall. But now that I was standing in it, I noticed something I hadn't before. Small, black cameras mounted in the corners, their lenses pointed down the length of the corridor. And just a few feet away, lying on the floor near the wall, was the source of the metallic dragging noise. It was a cart. A metal cart like the kind you'd see in a hospital, with wheels that squeaked faintly as it moved. It wasn't moving anymore, it was just sitting there, empty. I stood frozen in the corridor, staring at the empty metal cart. Its small, squeaky wheels were still, but I could tell it had been moving recently. There were faint smudges on the polished floor, like tracks leading away from it. The hallway stretched out into darkness in both directions. The lights here were dimmer than the fluorescent glare of the room then trapped in, and the first time in what felt like years, I felt unsteady on my feet. The cool air made my skin prickle, and the silence felt even heavier out here. I didn't want to move. The logical part of me screamed to go back, the safety of my cell, even if I ration it in there. But the irrational part of me, the part that knew I couldn't survive much longer in that tiny, lifeless box, pushed me forward. I walked to the cart and inspected it. It was simple, utilitarian, like the kind you'd see being pushed by nurses in a hospital. There were a few scratches on the surface, and one of the wheels looked slightly bent. But aside from that, it was unremarkable. No food trays, no papers, no tools. It didn't tell me anything about who, or what, had been delivering my meals. I thought about the cameras I'd seen mounted in the corners of the corridor. Were they working? If someone had been watching me all this time, they had to know I was out now. But the lenses weren't moving, and was no blinking light to indicate they were active. If they were recording anything, they weren't doing it in real time. Or maybe they'd stopped working a long time ago. I decided to move. I didn't have a plan. I didn't know where the hallway led or if there was even an exit. But standing still wasn't an option. The silence pressed down on me like a weight, and I needed to do something. The corridor seemed endless, the lights flickering faintly as I walked. Every few feet, I passed doors, just like the one I'd been locked behind. Most of them were closed, but one or two had been left slightly ajar, revealing rooms identical to mine. A bed, a toilet, and nothing else. Were there other participants? Had there ever been? The thought made my chest tighten. If there had been others, they weren't here anymore. I walked for what felt like hours, though it might have been only minutes. The corridor twisted and turned, splitting off into other hallways and stairwells, each one looking just as empty as the last. I tried to keep track of where I was going, but it was impossible. The layout of the place felt deliberately confusing, like it had been designed to disorient anyone who wandered through it. Eventually, I came across something different. At the end of one of the corridors, there was a large metal door. It was sturdier than the others, with a keypad and card reader mounted on the wall beside it. The sight of it gave me a strange mix of hope and dread. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the key card that sent me on the food tray. It was smooth and black, with no markings to suggest what it might unlock. I swiped it through the reader, holding my breath as I waited for a response. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the reader emitted a faint beep, and the door clicked open. I hesitated, my hand on the handle. This was it, my chance to finally get out of this nightmare. But as I pulled the door open and stepped inside, I realized I hadn't found an exit. I'd found a control room. The room was small, lined with monitors and equipment that looked outdated, like something you'd see in a government facility from in 1980s. Most of the screens were dark, their displays covered in dust, but a few were still on, showing static. Filled feeds of the empty corridors I'd just walked through. At the center of the room was a desk cluttered with papers, books, notebooks, and Monarchy cards. A given. I sifted through the papers, hoping to find some kind of explanation, but most of them were incomprehensible. Pages of data, diagrams, and charts with labels like Phase 3 observations and sensory deprivation study results. I flipped through one of the notebooks, scanning the handwritten notes. Subject Zaben for 15 weeks. Signs of severe cognitive degradation. Subject 1008. Removed after 9 months due to medical complications. Subject to Atalo, terminated following provilli stomach turned. Subject numbers, not names. What happened to them? I kept flipping until I found a note that made my chest tighten. Subject L01 and 25. Indefinite extension approved. Contingency protocols initiated. No further observation required. That was my number, the one on the trays. My hands shook as I put the notebook down. Indefinite extension. No further observation. What did that mean? Had they abandoned me? Was I just left here, forgotten? I looked back at the monitors. Most of them were still showing static, but one, in the corner, caught my eye. It wasn't showing the corridors or my room. It was showing this room. The image was grainy, black and white, but there was no mistaking it. I could see the back of my own head, the desk, the papers I'd just touched. I turned around, scanning the corners of the room for the camera, but I didn't see one. I stared back at the monitor, my reflection staring at me from the static-filled feed. And then, the screen flickered, for just a moment, barely a second. I thought I saw something else on the screen, a figure, not me. Just standing there in the corner of the control room. But when I turned, the corner was empty. I don't know what this place is. I don't know who put me here or why they abandoned it, or me. But the worst part is, I don't think I was ever meant to leave. The door to the control room is still open, but I can't bring myself to walk back out into the corridor, to leave. Where do I go? The hallways feel endless, and even if I find another way out, I have no idea what's waiting for me on the other side. For now, I'm staying here, writing this, in the hope that someone will find it. Maybe this is part of the experiment, or maybe it's over, and they just forgot I existed. But if you're reading this, don't sign up for something if you don't know what you're getting into. I don't know how much time passed after I found the control room. Days, months, it all blurred together the same way it always did. The only difference was that now I wasn't sitting in that tiny, windowless room anymore. I was in the control room, surrounded by dark monitors, outdated equipment, and stacks of papers I'd gone over 100 times. The papers didn't give me answers I was looking for. They were vague, full of scientific jargon I couldn't fully understand. But every so often, I'd find something, an entry in a notebook, a line in a report, that made me feel like I was getting closer to the truth. And then one day, I found it. It was tucked into the back of a manila folder, hidden beneath layers of spreadsheets and data charts. A photograph. At first, I didn't think much of it. It was an old black and white photo, a group of people standing in front of what looked like the same facility I was in. Scientists, I guessed. Some of them were holding clipboards, others smiling awkwardly for the camera. But one face stood out. He was standing near the center, his expression neutral but somehow familiar. It took me a moment to process why, but when I did, I felt the air leave my lungs. It was my dad. Let me back up for a second. My dad and I weren't exactly close. I mean, we weren't estranged or anything, but we'd grown apart over the years. He was always a bit of a workaholic, constantly traveling for conferences, staying late at his office, and missing birthdays because of important meetings. As a kid, I used to beg him to tell me about his job, but he never gave me a straight answer. "It's boring stuff," he'd say. "Research and data collection. You wouldn't understand." Eventually, I stopped asking. When my parents divorced, he moved out, and we drifted even further apart. We'd still talk on the phone every now and then, usually around the holidays, but it was always surface-level stuff. "How's work? How's mom? Let me know if you need anything." But looking at that photo, I couldn't deny it. That was him. Younger, sure, probably in his 30s, but definitely him. The realization hit me in waves. He'd been part of this place, this experiment. He'd stood in front of this very building, smiling with his colleagues, while people like me were locked away inside. I tried to think back to last time I'd spoken to him. It must have been years ago, before I signed up for this experiment. Had he known I was going to end up here? Had he been watching me all this time? My hand shook as I flipped the photo over. There was a date scrawled on the back, June 7th, 1988. That was almost 25 years ago. I stared at the photo, my thoughts racing. If my dad had been involved in this experiment, then he might still have access to this place. He might know I was here. He might have been the one who left me here. I don't remember making the decision to leave control room. One moment I was sitting there, staring at the photo, and the next, I was walking down the corridor. The keycard clutched tightly in my hand. I wasn't sure where I was going. Most of the doors were locked, and the ones that weren't led to empty rooms. But eventually, I found what I was looking for, a stairwell. The stairs were narrow and steep, leading up to a heavy metal door with a rusted handle. It took all my strength to push it open. But when I did, it was met in something I hadn't seen in years. Sunlight. It wasn't much, just a faint beam streaming through a crack in the ceiling. But it was enough to make my eyes water. I stumbled forward, squinting against the brightness, until I realized I was standing in an old, crumbling lobby. The furniture was covered in dust, the windows boarded up, but the front door was wide open. I didn't stop to think. I just ran. Finding my dad wasn't easy. I didn't have my phone, my wallet, or any of my personal belongings. I didn't even know what year it was or how far I'd been from civilization. But eventually, I made it to a nearby town. I don't even remember the name of it. I just remember the stares I got from people as I wandered through the streets, barefoot and disheveled, asking for directions to the nearest library. It took me weeks to track him down. By the time I found him, I was living in a rundown motel surviving out of donated vending machine snacks. Managed to piece together enough information from public records and old photos to figure out where he was working, a private research firm in New York. I showed up at his office unannounced. He didn't recognize me at first. I can't really blame him. I looked nothing like the person he probably remembered. My hair was longer, my face thinner, and I was still wearing clothes I'd gotten from a donation box at a church. "Dad," I said, my voice shaking. He stared at me for a long moment, his expression unreadable. And then he said name. "Alex." "What are you doing?" he asked, his voice calm but tense. I didn't know where to start. My mind was a mess of questions and accusations, but the only thing I could get out was, "What?" He looked at me like he didn't understand. "Why what? What did you do this?" I demanded. "What did you leave me there?" His expression didn't change. If anything, he looked tired. "I didn't leave you there," he said quietly. "Then what happened?" My voice cracked as I spoke. "Knew I was there, didn't you? You were part of this whole thing." For a moment, I thought he might deny it, but then he sighed and gestured for me to sit down. "You don't understand," he said. "It wasn't supposed to be. It was experiment. You were shut down. Decades, even. Then why was I still there?" I demanded. He hesitated, his eyes darting to the door like he was afraid someone might overhear us. "Don't know," he admitted. After the project was discontinued, the facility was supposed to be decommissioned. All the subjects were released. "But," he trailed off, his face pale. "But, what?" He looked at me, his expression unreadable. "Not everyone wanted the experiment to end," he said finally. "There were disagreements. People who thought we should keep going, no matter the cost." "Are you telling me they just left me there?" I asked, my voice rising. He didn't answer. I never got the closure I was looking for. Mike claimed he didn't know who had kept the experiment running, but part of me didn't believe him. He'd been involved in this from the start, and whether he wanted to admit it or not, he'd played a role in what happened to me. I walked out of his office that day and never looked back. It's been months since then, and I'm still trying to put my life back together. Some days, I feel like I've made progress. Other days, I wonder if I'll ever be able to move on. The only thing I know for sure is that I'm never going to stop asking questions. Because somewhere out there, someone still knows the truth. And one day, I'm going to find them. Alright, so Lem prefaces by saying, I'm not your typical, lurking in the shady corners of the internet kind of guy. I don't mess with scams, I don't snoop around where I'm not supposed to, and I definitely don't have a death wish. But every now and then, I get curious, like really curious. And once I find a rabbit hole, I just gotta keep digging till I hit rock bottom. That's exactly how this whole mess started. I was home alone a few months back, just scrolling through Reddit like I always do. Nothing unusual, just jumping from meme threads to random AIMA posts. At some point, I stumbled into this subreddit about creepy internet mysteries. I won't name it here because it's way too niche, and I don't need people trying to retrace my steps. Anyway, someone in the comments mentioned the dark web. Now, I'd heard of the dark web, obviously. I mean, who hasn't? It's that mysterious part of the internet where everyone imagines hackers and criminals hanging out 24/7. But that's not the whole truth. It's really just a bunch of websites that don't show up on Google or regular browsers. You need special software, like the Tor browser, to access them. So out of sheer boredom, and yeah, maybe a little curiosity, I decided to download Tor. I didn't think I'd actually find anything. I was expecting most of it to be broken links or spam. But after about an hour of poking around, I stumbled across this forum. It didn't look like much, just plain text on a black background. The site was called something generic like Hidden Files Exchange, and it was full of people trading random documents and links to weird websites. I wasn't planning on staying long. I was just scrolling out of curiosity when this one post caught my eye. The title said, "Forgotten WW1 Research Facility, coordinates enclosed." It wasn't flashy or anything, just a short paragraph describing some kind of abandoned underground laboratory that supposedly dated back to World War I. The post mentioned that it had been used for secret government experiments, specifically stuff like telekinesis, hypnosis, and mind control. Apparently, the facility was hidden away in some remote area and it was just left to rot. The experiments were deemed unsuccessful. There were no photos, no proof, just a vague description and a set of GPS coordinates. The whole thing screamed, but it hooked me in. The idea of uncovering some forgotten piece of history, something straight out of a conspiracy theory, was just too tempting to ignore. Plus, I've always had this weird thing for old, abandoned places. There's something eerie but fascinating about them, you know? The thing that really sealed the deal for me was that the location wasn't too far from where I lived. I won't give you exact details, but let's just say it was somewhere deep in the woods, about a 3-hour drive from my small town. It was close enough that it felt like an adventure, but far enough to make feel like I was stepping way outside my comfort zone. I copied the coordinates, pasted them into Google Maps, and bam. The spot was marked as this dense of forest in the middle of nowhere. There were no roads leading in, just miles and miles of trees. I almost laughed at myself for even considering it. Who just drives out into the woods based on some random post on a dark web forum? But then again, I wasn't doing anything that weekend. The next couple of days were spent obsessively researching the area. I couldn't find anything on the facility itself. No historical records, no news articles, nothing. But the more I thought about it, the more I convinced myself that maybe that was the point. If this place was so secret, it made sense that there wouldn't be any public information about it. By Friday, I had made up my mind. I told myself it was just a day trip, nothing serious. I packed a flashlight, my phone porter, charger, some snacks, and a bottle of water. I even downloaded an offline map of the area on my phone, just in case I lost signal in the woods. I set out early Saturday morning. The drive itself was uneventful, just a straight shot on the highway until I reached the smaller, winding road that led toward the forest. The closer I got, the more isolated everything felt. There were fewer cars, fewer houses. By the time I reached the GPS coordinates, I was pretty much in the middle of nowhere. I parked my car on the side of the road, grabbed my stuff, and started walking. The trail wasn't marked, but it was there, a narrow path cutting through the dense trees. The air was damp, and the forest was eerily quiet. I walked for what felt like forever, occasionally checking phone to make sure as I was heading in the right direction. Eventually, I came across something that just didn't belong, a rusted metal door, embedded in the side of a hill. It was covered in moss and barely visible against the greenery. If I hadn't been looking for it, I probably would have walked right past it. The door didn't have a handle, just a small, circular hole where one might have been at some point. I pushed on it, and to my surprise, it swung open with this awful creak. Behind it was a narrow staircase leading down into the earth. At this point, I should have turned back. I know that. But the curiosity was just too much to ignore. I took out my flashlight, stepped inside, and started descending. The air grew colder as I went deeper, and the sound of my footsteps echoed off the walls. The stairs eventually ended, opening up into this long, dimly lit corridor. The walls were made of concrete, and the floor was covered in a layer of dust, so thick I could see my footprints. There were no signs, no markings, nothing to tell me what this place was. Just silence and darkness. I walked down the hallway, peeking into the rooms on either side. Most of them were empty, just small, windowless spaces with rusted metal furniture and broken equipment. But then, I found something that made my heart skip a beat. It was a large room filled with old machines, the kind you'd expect to see in a sci-fi movie. There were metal chairs with restraints on the armrests, strange devices, wires and dials, and this massive console covered in switches and buttons. I walked up to one of the machines and wiped the dust off the surface. The words engraved on it were in German, which made sense given the whole World War I connection. I don't speak German, but I recognized some of the words from online translators. Things like Gedanken control, mind control, and hypnosis. The creepiness of the place was starting to get to me. I thought about turning back, but then I noticed something on the far side of the room, a filing cabinet. It was half open, with papers spilling out of it. I walked over and started rifling through the documents. Most of them were faded and completely unreadable, but one caught my attention. It had a diagram of a human brain, along with handwritten notes in German. The only words I could make out were telekinesis and control. Control. I don't know why, but I decided to take the paper with me. It felt like proof that this place was real, that it wasn't just some elaborate prank. I was about to leave when I noticed another door at the back of the room. It was slightly ajar, and beyond it was another staircase, leading even further down. I don't know what I was expecting when I opened that second door. It wasn't this. The staircase behind it was way narrower than the first, with metal steps that creaked under my weight. It spiraled downward for what felt like forever, the air growing heavier with each step. My flashlight flickered once, and I nearly dropped it in panic. The thought of being stuck down there in complete darkness was enough to make me reconsider the whole thing. But I pressed on, gripping the flashlight like my life depended on it. At the bottom of the staircase, I found myself in a smaller corridor. The air down there was noticeably colder, with a faint metallic smell that reminded me of rust, or maybe old machinery. The walls were different, too. No longer concrete, they were lined with these strange panels, like they were built to house wiring or ventilation systems. This part of the facility felt more advanced than the upper levels, almost futuristic in a way, despite how old everything clearly was. There were more rooms branching off the corridor, but these weren't like the ones above. First door I looked into looked like a laboratory. The tables were covered in glass beakers, metal trays, and what I could only describe as prototypes for medical equipment. Some of the tools looked vaguely familiar, like early versions of EEG machines or defibrillators, but others were completely alien to me. One device caught my attention in particular. It looked like a helmet, but it was connected to a web of wires that docks with dials and switches. I couldn't figure out what it was supposed to do, but there was a faint label on the side that read something like Rucker, other German word I didn't understand. I snapped a picture with my phone, thinking I could try to translate it later. The more I looked around, the more uneasy I felt. Not scared, exactly, but there was this weird sensation that wasn't supposed to be there. Like I was intruding on something that had been forgotten for a reason. I moved to another room down the hall. This one was locked with a rusted padlock. It didn't take much effort to break it off, The metal practically crumbled in my hands. Inside, I found what I can only describe as a storage room. Shelves lined the walls, filled with dusty file boxes and stacks of old documents. There were jars of chemicals, too, some with faded labels in German, and others with symbols I didn't recognize. But what really stood out were the photographs. They were scattered across one of the shelves, black and white images that had clearly been taken decades ago. Most of the photos showed people sitting in those metos I'd seen earlier, wires strapped to their heads or arms. Their expressions were blank, almost lifeless, and it was hard to tell if they were asleep or just unresponsive. A few of the photos had handwritten notes scrawled on the back, but the ink had smudged over time, making them almost impossible to read. The only clear word I could make out was verse such personen, which I later found out means subjects. I started going through one of the file boxes, hoping to find something in English, or at least something I could translate later. Most of it was technical jargon that went way over my head, but I did find a few documents with diagrams and charts that caught my eye. One of them showed what looked like a map of the human brain, with certain areas circled and labeled. Another had instructions for some kind of experiment, with words like P-troll repeated over and over. I wasn't sure what any of it meant, but it was clear that this place had been dedicated to some kind of psychological or neurological research. Whether or not it had anything to do with superpowers superimposed like the form most, I couldn't say. But the more I read, the more I started to believe that the people running this facility had been way ahead of their time, like decades ahead. I spent a little too long in that room, snapping photos of anything that looked important. By the time I moved on, my phone battery was already down to 6%. I kept telling myself I'd leave soon, but every time I found something new, I felt like I was getting closer to uncovering the truth about this place. The last room of that day was, by far, the strangest. It was larger than the others, with rows of what looked like containment chambers along the walls. They reminded me of those cryopods you see in sci-fi movies, long metal tubes with glass fronts and control panels on the side. Most of them were empty, but a few were sealed shut, with condensation fogging up the glass. I don't know why, but I felt this overwhelming need to see what was inside one of them. I wiped the fog from the glass of the nearest pod, and immediately wished I hadn't. Inside was a mannequin. Or at least, that's what I told myself at first. It was humanoid in shape, but its features were all wrong. The proportions were slightly off, like it had been sculpted by someone, only had a vague idea of what a person was supposed to look like. The longer I stared at it, the more details I noticed. Its skin was pale and waxy, with faint lines that looked almost like veins running beneath the surface. Its eyes were closed, and its mouth was slightly open, revealing what looked like teeth. I don't know. It could have been some kind of medical dummy or an early attempt at creating an artificial human, but whatever it was, it gave me a seriously bad feeling. I backed away from the pod, deciding I'd seen enough for one day. Whatever this place was, it wasn't just a research facility. It was something else, something much stranger. I made my way back up the staircase, through the upper levels, and out into the woods. By the time I reached my car, it was already starting to get dark. I drove home in silence, trying to process everything I'd seen. Part of me wanted to forget the whole thing, to pretend never gone there. Another part of me knew I could let it go, not yet. I still had the photos, the documents. And that one nagging question that refused to leave my mind. What had they been trying to accomplish here? The next few days after I visited the facility were a total blur. My brain felt like it was running on overdrive, trying to make sense of everything I'd seen. I couldn't stop thinking about the strange machines, the sealed pods, and especially those cryptic documents. I didn't tell anyone about the trip. I mean, how do you even start that conversation? Oh, hey, I spent my Saturday exploring a hidden lab from World War I. Want to see some creepy pictures? Yeah, no thanks. But the thing is, I couldn't just let it go. It felt like I'd stumbled onto something way bigger than myself, something that shouldn't have been forgotten. So, I decided to dig deeper, but this time from the safety of my own home. The first thing I did was through the photos on my phone. Most of them were just snapshots of the rooms and machines, but a few stood out. There was the diagram of the human brain, the strange German instructions, and of course, the image of that mannequin-like thing, the pod. I zoomed in on the writing wherever I could and started translating the words using Google Translate. Most of it was technical jargon that I didn't fully understand, but certain phrases kept popping up. Gedanken control, mind control, neurologische manipulation, and neurological manipulation, and personliche Hickaden, paranormal abilities. There was even a mention of psychokrieg, which roughly translates to psychokinetic warfare. At this point, it started to click. Whoever had been running that facility wasn't just experimenting with human psychology, they were trying to weaponize it. The idea sounded ridiculous, like something out of a comic book, but the evidence was right there in front of me. These people had been trying to create soldiers with superhuman abilities. The more I translated, the more unsettling it became. One document mentioned something about Die Schwelle des Bewusstseins, the threshold of consciousness. It sounded like they were trying to push the human brain beyond its natural limits. But there were also notes about failures and irreversible consequences. I didn't want to think too hard about what that might mean. I spent hours on my computer, cross-referencing the words I found with anything I could dig up online. Most of the results led me to obscure scientific papers or conspiracy theory forums. But one link stood out. It was an old website, archived on a dark web forum, buried under layers of unrelated posts. The site was basic, just white text on a black background, like the one where I'd first found the coordinates. But this one had a name: Project Shatangist, Project Shadowminged. The website described an experimental program, allegedly run during World War I by a coalition of scientists from several countries. Their goal, according to the site, was to unlock hidden potential in the human mind, abilities like telepathy, telekinesis, and enhanced memory. The idea was that these abilities could give soldiers an edge on the battlefield. But here's where it gets weird. The program supposedly went dark in the early 1920s. According to the site, all records of Project Shadowmine were erased, and any remaining facilities were abandoned. Officially, the program was deemed a failure, with no measurable results to show for years of experimentation. But unofficially, some people believed the experiments had gone too far, that the scientists had succeeded in ways they hadn't anticipated. At this point, I was way too deep at the rabbit hole to stop. I went back to the documents I'd taken from the facility, trying to match them with anything I could find on the website. Most of it was too fragmented to piece together, but a few things lined up, like the brain diagrams and the references to test subjects. Then I found something that stopped me in my tracks. Buried in the text of one of the archived pages was a phrase I had seen in the facility. The test subjects. According to the website, the facility I'd explored wasn't just a research lab. It was one of several testing sites where human volunteers were subject to experiments designed to lock their potential. I wish I could say that the worst of it, but it wasn't. Another document I'd taken from the lab had a list of names, dates, and what I assumed were experiment numbers. I didn't recognize any of the names, but the dates were what stood out. Most of them were from the early 1900s, which made sense given the World War I connection. But there were a few dates that didn't add up, specifically ones from the 1940s and 50s. That didn't. If the program had been shut down in 1920s, why were there records from decades later? I couldn't stop thinking about it. Maybe the program hadn't really been shut down. Maybe it had just changed names or gone deeper underground. The thought was unsettling, but it also explained why there was no public record of the facility I'd found. I spent the rest of the night trying to decipher more of the documents, but it was slow going. Most of the text was smudged or faded, and the German handwriting was hard to read. By the time I finally went to bed, my brain felt fried. The next morning, I woke up to a string of notifications on my phone. Apparently, one of the photos I'd taken, the one of the mannequin-like figure in the pod, had automatically loaded to my cloud storage. I hadn't even realized it was synced. Worse, I'd accidentally shared it to a private album on Facebook. It only took a minute to delete the post, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone might have seen it. Not because I was worried about people coming after me or anything, just because I didn't want to deal with questions. How do you even explain something like that without sounding crazy? After that, I decided to take a break. I'd spent enough time obsessing over facility, and I needed to clear my head. But even as I tried to move on, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the story, more than I could uncover on my own. That's when I decided to reach out for help. After a few days of taking a step back, I realized something. I wasn't getting anywhere on my own. Sure, I'd translated some of the documents and pieced together bits of information, but I was still staring at a giant puzzle with half the pieces missing. That's when I decided to reach to someone who might actually know what they were looking at. Now, I don't have some super genius scientist friend who specializes in secret government projects, but I do have a buddy, Alex, who's a bit of an internet sleuth. He's one of those people who can dig up information on just about anything. Need to find out what your company went out of business. He's your guy. Curious about an abandoned place you drove past once. He'll pull up old blueprints, zoning records, and Sona Lagranges before you even finished describing it. The only problem, I wasn't sure how to bring it up without sounding completely insane. So, I decided to ease into it. I texted him something like, "Hey man, quick question. How hard would it be to track down info in an abandoned lab, hypothetically speaking?" He responded almost immediately. "Hypothetically? Or are you about to tell me you found some underground bunker in the middle of nowhere?" I swear, the guy knows me too well. After some back and forth, I decided to just spill the basics. No dark web, no specifics about where the facility was. I told him I'd found an old research site, while hiking a little white lie to make it sound less sketchy, and that I'd come across some document science I couldn't fully understand. To my surprise, he didn't question it too much. Instead, he asked me to send him photos of the documents and any else I'd found. I hesitated at first, but I figured, why not? Worst case, he'd think I was nuts. Best case, he'd help me figure out what this place actually was. A couple of hours later, Alex called me. Okay. Dude, he said, you're either messing with me or you just stumbled onto something really weird. He'd started digging into the German words from the documents and the terms I'd given him. Most of what he found lined up with what I already knew. References to experiments on telekinesis, mind control, and other paranormal abilities. But there was something else, something I hadn't found in my own research. Have you ever heard of the Monkey Ultra program? He asked. I had vaguely. It was that CIA thing from the 1950s where they experiment with mind control techniques, right? I'd seen a documentary about it once, but I hadn't thought about it in years. Well, here's the thing, Alex said. Some people think MKUltra wasn't the start of the program. It was just a continuation, like the US picked up where other countries left off after World War II. I didn't say anything, but my mind immediately went back to the dates I'd seen on those documents. The experiments in the 1940s and 50s. Could this facility have been one of the places where it all started? Alex must have noticed my silence because he kept going. I found a couple of mentions of something called Project Shadowman. It's pretty obscure, but it lines up with the stuff you sent me. Supposedly, it was an international effort during World War I to study psychic phenomena and enhanced mental abilities. It sounds like most of the records were destroyed, but there are rumors that some of the research got picked up by other countries later on. What to say? On one hand, it felt good to know I wasn't completely crazy. This thing was real, and I wasn't the only one who knew about it. But on the other hand, it just raised more questions. Who had been running the facility? Why had it been abandoned? And most importantly, what had happened to the people involved? Do you think any of it worked? I asked finally. Alex paused for a second. Hard to say. A lot of the stuff I've read makes it sound like it was just pseudoscience. People chase something that didn't exist. But then again, if they really were experimenting on people, who knows? Maybe they did figure something out, and it just didn't work the way they wanted. That last part stuck with me. It reminded me of the photos I'd found in the lab, the test subjects strapped into those chairs, the sealed pods, the mannequin-like figure. What if it wasn't a mannequin? What if it was something else? Something left behind when the experiments went wrong? Alex said he'd keep digging. Let me know if he found anything else. In the meantime, I decided to go back through the rest of the photos and documents, hoping I'd missed something important. That's when I remembered the encrypted files. When I first went through the papers, I'd come across a stack of pages filled with what looked like gibberish. Random letters and symbols, almost like a code. I hadn't paid much attention to them at the time, but as I then came, be able to figure them out. But now, with Alex's help, I figured it was worth a shot. I sent him a few pictures of the encrypted documents, and within minutes, he was texting me back. This is a cipher, he said. It's old school, but I might be able to crack it. Give me a couple of hours. While I waited, I couldn't stop thinking about what he'd said earlier about MKUltra and Project Shadowmind. If the experiments had been going on for decades, how much had they really discovered? Were the rumors about psychic abilities and mind control just that, rumors? Or was there some truth to it? By the time Alex called me back, I was practically pacing my living room. Okay, so I only cracked part of it, he said. But it's weird. The text I translated keeps talking about a conduit. A conduit for what? I asked. He admitted, the document makes it sound like the human brain is just a piece of a larger system, like a receiver or a bridge. It mentions something about external forces, like something outside us, that the brain is supposed to connect to, but it doesn't explain what those forces are. I didn't know what to say. The idea sounded crazy, but at the same time, it kind of made sense. If the facility had really been trying to push the lushy limits of human potential, maybe been looking for a way to tap into something beyond our normal understanding of the world. I think you need to go back, Alex said suddenly. What? Why? Because there's more to this than what you found so far. I don't think you've seen everything that facility has to offer. I wasn't sure if I agreed, but a part of me couldn't help wondering if he was right. I didn't want to go back to the facility. I told myself it wasn't worth the risk. But after Alex cracked part of that cipher and mentioned the word conduit, I couldn't stop thinking about what else might be hidden down there. Was there something I'd missed? Another clue that could tie all of this together. The more I thought about it, the more restless I became. By the end of the week, I'd made up my mind. Packed the same bag I'd taken the first time, flashlight, portable charger, snacks, water, all the essentials. But this time, I also brought a notebook and a better camera. If I was going back again, docket everything as thoroughly as possible. The drive to the forest felt longer than I remembered, but that was probably because I was overthinking the entire trip. By the time I reached the trailhead and parked my car, it was late morning. I figured I had plenty of daylight to explore, so I grabbed my bag and headed into the woods. The door to the facility was still there, exactly as I'd left it. Part of me had expected it to be gone, sealed up or barricaded, anything to prove that I wasn't supposed to be there. But no, it was just sitting there, rusted and overgrown, like it had been for decades. I took a deep breath, pushed it open, and started down the staircase. The upper levels were exactly the same as before, dusty, cold, and silent. I moved quickly through the rooms I'd already explored, barely stopping to glance at the old machines and filing cabinets. My goal this time was to go deeper, to see if there were any areas I'd missed on my first visit. When I reached the lower level, I felt a strange sense of déjà vu. The narrow corridor, the laboratory, the storage room, it was all just as I'd remembered. But this time, I noticed something I hadn't seen before. At the far end of the corridor, past the row of sealed pods, there was another door. It was smaller than the others, almost hidden in the shadows. The first time I'd been here, I must have walked right past it without even realizing it was there. The door was locked, but the lock itself was old and brittle. A few hard pulls, and it snapped right off. Behind the door was yet another staircase, but this one was even steeper than the others. The walls were lined with pipes, and the air smelled damp and metallic, like old water. As I descended, I felt like I was entering the heart of the facility. The deeper I went, the more it felt like this was where everything had really happened. At the bottom of the staircase, I found myself in a massive underground chamber. The ceiling was high, and the walls were lined with more of those strange panels I'd seen earlier. But the centerpiece of the room was what caught my attention. A large, circular platform, surrounded by metal consoles and wires. The platform reminded me of something you'd see in a sci-fi movie, like a teleportation pad or a machine designed to harness energy. It was covered in strange markings, some of which glowed faintly in the dim light. I had no idea what it was supposed to do, but it was clear that this was the facility's main focus. I walked around the platform, taking pictures from every angle. The consoles surrounding it were covered in dials, switches, and screens, all of which were dark and lifeless. But there was something odd about the way they were positioned. It was almost like they were designed to monitor something, to record data from whatever happened on the platform. On one of the consoles, I found a stack of papers, tucked beneath a layer of dust. Most of them were incomprehensible, filled with mathematical equations and technical schematics. But one page stood out. It was a single sheet of paper with a hand-drawn diagram of the platform, surrounded by notes written in German. I took a photo and later translated it with Alex's help. The notes mentioned something called Wellenbergergun, which translates to weave transmission. It also referenced the conduit again, describing it as a bridge between dimensions. Dimensions. That was new. Up until now, I'd been operating under the assumption that this facility was focused on psychic abilities, telekinesis, hypnosis, mind control. But if the notes were accurate, the experiments had gone far beyond that. They weren't just trying to enhance the human mind. They were trying to connect to something else, something outside of our reality. The implications were a lot to process. I tried to push the thought aside and focus on what was in front of me. As I continued searching the room, I noticed another small console, tucked away in a corner. Unlike the others, this one had a power switch that still seemed intact. Against my better judgment, I flipped the switch. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a low hum, the console flickered to life. The screen glowed faintly, the screen glows of text in German. I didn't recognize most of the words, but one line stood out. Energie unzureichend, Aktivierung fehlgeschlagen. I would later translate that for me as insufficient power supply. Activation failed. I wasn't sure whether feel relieved or disappointed. On one hand, I didn't really want to find out what that platform was capable of. On the other hand, I felt like I'd hit a dead end. If the machine couldn't be activated, what was the point of all this? I couldn't shake the feeling that I was missing something. I took a few more pictures of the room, then made my way back up the stairs. I decided I'd seen enough for one day. That was my last visit to the facility. Since then, I've spent countless hours going through the documents, trying to piece together the story of what happened there. Alex has been a huge help, but even he admits there are too many gaps in the puzzle. From what we can tell, the facility was part of Project Shadow Mind, an international effort to study and weapisic phenomena during World War I. The experiments focused on pushing the limits of the human brain, with the ultimate goal of creating a conduit capable of connecting to something. Whether that something was another dimension, a higher plane of existence, or just an abstract concept, we don't know. What we do know is that the program didn't end when the war did. The documents suggest that the experiments continued in secret for decades, possibly under new names and new leadership. But at some point, the facility was abandoned, left to decay in the middle of nowhere. I don't know why it was shut down. Maybe the experiments failed, or maybe they succeeded in ways the scientists didn't anticipate. Either way, the facility remains a relic of a forgotten time, a reminder of humanity's constant desire to push the boundaries of what's possible. As for me, I haven't been back since that second visit. I still think about it sometimes. About the glowing platform, the strange documents, and the figure in the pod. Part of me wonders if I should have left it all alone, if I poked my nose into something I wasn't meant to see. But another part of me can't help but feel like this isn't the end of the story. And I have to say, Sorry for my pathetic German. Alright, so this whole mess started because of a really dumb impulse. Like, what was I even thinking levels of dumb? I've always been a sucker for weird internet stuff, the kind of creepy stories you find on Reddit at 3 a.m. or in some YouTube video with, like, 10 views. Those rabbit holes that lead to supposedly cursed websites, strange forums, or urban legends about the dark web. Blame it on all the creepypasta I devoured in high school, I guess. Anyway, it wasn't like I had this grand plan to summon a demon or anything. It was a joke, literally. A few weeks ago, I was chilling on Discord with my buddies, Mark and Alex. We were just being bored, swapping dumb TikToks, talking about how AI is going to take over the world, and watching some random streamer. Somehow, I don't remember how the conversation veered off into dark web territory. Alex, being Alex, started bragging about how easy it is to get on there. He was all, "Dude, all you need is the Tor browser and a decent VPN. It's no big deal." Of course, Mark and I weren't about to lead away with that, so we dared him to prove it. He chickened out, naturally. He's all talk, that one. But still, that planted a seed in my head. That night, after everyone logged off, I was like, why not? Not because some kind of hacker genius or anything. I was just curious. I wanted to see what the dark web was actually like. So I downloaded the Tor browser, set up a VPN I had lying around from that time I tried to watch something that wasn't available in my country, and boom. I was staring at a completely different internet. It felt wrong, but also kind of exciting. Like I just unlocked a secret level in a video game, a level I probably shouldn't be in. Most of honestly pretty boring. Lots of sketchy marketplace pages selling fake passports, counterfeit money, and, probably way worse stuff that I didn't even want to think about. I wasn't stupid enough to click on anything, except for this one link, It just said, "The Bazaar of Numbers." Yeah, I know. Super original, right? Curiosity got the better of me, as usual. The site looked like it was straight out of the early 2000s. Plain black background, red text, and a flashing banner that screamed, "Own a piece of history. Buy a phone number with a story." My first thought was, this is some kind of elaborate scam or a weird art project. The homepage explained that each supposedly haunted or had some kind of paranormal significance. They were allegedly linked to unsolved crimes, urban legends, or synergies. Most of them were ridiculously overpriced, like $5,000 for numbers supposedly linked to the Zodiac Killer. Hard pass. But then, I saw one that was weirdly cheap. It was listed for $30 and the description just said, "They call at the same time every day. It knows your voice." I staring at the screen there, debating with myself. I wasn't scared. I don't even believe in ghosts and stuff. I figured it was some kind of prank call number, or maybe a pre-recorded message, like those old soundboards we used to mess around with online. But for call 30, that's like 2 fancy coffees. I convinced myself it would be funny to prank Mark and Alex with it. So, yet I bought it. The whole transaction was sketchy as hell. The site only accepted Bitcoin, so I had to figure out how to a crypto wallet, convert some cash, and transfer it this address that looked like a cat walked across the keyboard. A few minutes after I paid, I got an email. One sentence. Flith 1555 867 500 309 will be Act 10 PM. No instructions, no explanations, just the number. I rolled my eyes. So much for customer service. The next day, I totally forgot about the whole Kerr's number thing. Life went on as usual. Work was a drag. I spent my lunch break doom scrolling like always. and by the time I got home, pretty much convinced myself that the whole thing was a dud. Maybe the number wouldn't even work. Then, around 9:45 p.m., I was scrolling through Instagram, half watching some Netflix show in the background, when I remembered the email. I add a number to my contacts, label it cursed number, with a little skull emoji, because why not? I set my phone on my desk and waited. At exactly 10 p.m., my phone buzzed. The screen lit up, incoming call from cursed number. I don't know what I was expecting. Maybe some creepy breathing or robotic voice saying, 7 days. Like in that old horror movie. What I definitely wasn't expecting was my own voice. Hello. It was me. Or at least, it sounded exactly like me. The tone, the inflection, everything was identical, right down to the slight awkwardness I have when I answer calls from unknown numbers. Hello, I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. I could feel a little knot of unease forming in my stomach. For a second there was silence, then repeated, hello. It was like someone had recorded me and was playing it back. But here's the thing, I'd never said hello like that into a phone before. I could tell, because the way Kel said it on the call was oddly specific, like I was trying to get someone's attention in a crowded room. I hung up. For the next 10 minutes, I just sat there, staring at my phone, half expecting it to ring again. It didn't. Part of me wanted to laugh it off. Maybe the website had some kind of matching software. But how could they replicate my voice so perfectly and so quickly? It was more than a little freaky. The next day, I tried to put it out of my mind. Work was uneventful. Just the usual boring stuff. By the time I got home, I'd almost talked myself into believing that the call was just a one-off prank. But at 10 p.m., right on the dot, it rang again. This time, I hesitated before answering. What if I just let it go to voicemail? But then my stupid curiosity got the better of me again. I picked up, and before I could even say anything, I heard my voice again. Are you there? Are you there? I froze. Are you there? It repeated. It didn't sound like a recording this time. There was something different, like it was actually trying to have a conversation with me. I hung up again, my hands shaking this time. Okay, this is officially beyond weird. By day 3, the calls weren't just unsettling, they were straight up disturbing. That night, when I picked up, it wasn't just my voice anymore. It was my mom's. Why haven't you called me? It caught me so off guard that I almost dropped my phone. My mom passed away 5 years ago. Hearing her voice again, even like this, was like a punch to the gut. Why haven't you called me? The voice repeated, the same tone of gentle reproach she used to use when I was a kid. I hung up, and this time, I turned my phone completely off. I should have stopped there. I should have deleted the number, blocked it, thrown my phone into a volcano, whatever. But some messed up part of me was hooked. It wasn't just creepy, intentional. Like, the number was trying to tell me something. So, like an idiot, I decided to keep answering. And that's when things got really, really bad. The next few nights blurred together, but one thing stayed the same, the calls kept coming. Always at 10 p.m., always from that cursed number. I started to notice a pattern. Each time I answered, it was someone I knew, someone I had lost. The fourth night, it was my grandpa. He passed away when I was 12, and hearing his voice again, even distorted like this, felt like someone had ripped my heart out. He used to call me kiddo, and that's exactly what he said when I picked up. Kiddo, you need to listen to me. I didn't respond. I couldn't. You listening, kiddo? After that call, I stopped sleeping properly. I didn't dare tell anyone, not even Mark or Alex. I mean, How do you even explain something like this without sounding completely insane? He. So I bought a haunted phone number on the dark web, and now I'm getting calls from dead relatives. You believe me, right? Yeah, that was a hard no. I figured if I brought it up, they'd either laugh it off, or worse, think I was having some kind of breakdown. But the thing is, it wasn't just the voices. It was the way they talked. They all spoke like they were trying to tell me something urgent, like there was something I desperately needed to hear, but I kept hanging up before they could say it. On the fifth night, the call was different. At 10 p.m., my phone lit up as usual. By now, I had this routine where I'd just stare at the screen for a few seconds, debating whether or not to answer. This time, I let it ring until the last possible second before sipping to pick up. I said, my voice shaking just enough to make me cringe at myself. There was a long pause, and then, "It's me. It's No." It took me a second to process the name. No was my best friend from middle school. We hadn't spoken in years, not since he moved away. I found out through Facebook last year that he had died in a car accident. I don't have much time. The voice that sounded exactly like No said. I swear my heart stopped. I don't mean close similar. Kind of similar. It was him. I even recognized the little rasp he used to get when he talked too fast. You need to listen, he continued. It's important. This time I didn't hang up. What do you want? I asked, my voice trembling. There was another long pause, and then he said something that gave me actual goosebumps. Not the cheap horror movie kind, but the kind you get when someone tells you something you weren't ready to hear. It's not just me. We're all trying to reach you. Before I could respond, the call disconnected. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about what he said. We're all trying to reach you. Who was free? And why me? I started digging through the internet, trying to find any clues about the number. I searched Reddit, obscure forums, even Quora, any place where someone might have had a similar experience. But nothing came up. Every mention of haunted phone numbers just led me to urban legends, fake ghost stories, and scam websites. The only place I hadn't checked was the original site where I bought the number. But when I tried to access it, the link was dead. It just gave me a 404 not found error. Figures. By the seventh night, the calls were all I could think about. I barely touched my phone during the day, afraid that it might start ringing at a different time. But it never did. That was almost worse. Knowing it would only ever ring at 10 p.m., like clockwork. It was a countdown I couldn't escape. When the call came at night, I answered immediately. Who is this? I demanded, my voice louder than I intended. What do you want from me? This time, the voice wasn't anyone I recognized. It was deeper, more monotone, but still eerily familiar, like a warped version of my own voice. You asked for this. I didn't ask for anything. I shot back. You bought the number. He wasn't froze. I did buy it, but I didn't expect whatever this was. Why is this happening? I was trying to keep my voice steady. There was a pause, and then it said something that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. The door. What do you mean, a door? I demanded. But the call cut off before I could get an answer. After that, I stopped answering the calls. I thought maybe, just maybe, if I ignored them, they'd stop on their own. But they didn't. Every night the phone rang, and every night I let it go to voicemail. What was even stranger was that the voicemails weren't just recording for calls I didn't pick up. They were completely different. They'd say things I'd never heard during the live calls. One voicemail said, "It's already open." Another said, "You can't stop it, bot." And then there was the one that really messed me up. It was my dad's voice. My dad is still alive. When won't you answer me, son? I listened to that one over and over, trying to figure out if it was really him. It sounded like him, but not exactly. There was something off about it, like it wasn't recording but some trying to be him. By this point, I was desperate. I wanted to block the number, but no matter how many times I tried, it wouldn't let me. My phone just froze every time I hit block contact. I even tried factory resetting my phone, but somehow the number was still there when it rebooted. I thought about getting rid of my phone entirely, just chucking it in the river, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. It felt like, I don't know, giving up. Like if I didn't figure this out, I'd regret it forever. I needed answers. So, I made the one choice I hadn't tried yet. The next night, I decided to cut the call and stay on the line, no matter what I heard. When the clock struck 9:59 p.m. on the 8th night, I sat in my room with my phone in my hand, staring at the screen like I was waiting for a bomb to go off. The air felt heavier somehow, maybe from the anticipation or from knowing what I'd committed myself to. Tonight, I wasn't hang up no matter what. I was going to stay on the line and try to get answers. At exactly 10 p.m., the phone buzzed. Incoming call from cursed number. I answered it immediately, my heart pounding. Hello, said, trying to sound as calm as possible. At first, there was silence. Not the static kind of silence you get on a bad connection. This was complete silence, like the line itself wasn't real. Then, a voice spoke. We need to talk. It was my voice again, but not like the other times. This one sounded older, more serious, almost like I was speaking to a version of myself from the future. Talk about what? I asked. The voice paused before answering. The number. It's not just a number. It's a way in. A way into what? To us, it replied. That it make any sense. What does that even mean? Who's Zeus? You already know, the voice said. You've heard us. I thought back to all the other calls. My mom, my grandpa, no. Even my dad's voice in the voicemail. You mean the people who've called me? They're all waiting, interrupted. That sentence sent a chill down my spine, but I kept my composure. Waiting for what? To see if you'll listen, the voice said. But there are rules. If you don't follow them, it won't stop. Folly, it was getting something concrete. What rules? I asked. The line crackled slightly before the voice replied. You've already broken one. Never hang up once you've answered. I swallowed hard. Okay. What else? Another rule. It continued. Another let it go to voicemail. So what? I just answer every call and stay on the line forever, I asked, my frustration leaking through. No, the voice said firmly. You answer. You listen. And when it's done, you wait for the next one. That's the only way. Why, I asked? Didn't sign up for this. You buff a number, the voice said flatly. You opened the door. I wanted to scream. This wasn't fair. How was I supposed to know what I was getting into? It was just some random website on the dark web. None of this should have real. Before I could say anything else, the voice added one final warning. Don't try to stop the calls. Don't try to block the number. And whatever you do, don't involve anyone else. You'll make it worse. The call ended abruptly. For a while, I just sat there, staring at my phone, trying to process what I just heard. Rules. A door. Waiting for me to listen. It sounded like some kind of twisted game. But I wasn't even sure who or what I was playing against. I didn't sleep that night. I spent hours scrolling through my phone, searching for anything that could explain what was happening. But everything I found was useless. Just more fake stories, urban legends, and wild theories. I thought about breaking the rules, just to see what would happen, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. What if the voice was right? What if breaking the rules made things worse? The next night at 10 p.m. sharp, the call came again. I picked it up, my hands trembling slightly. Hello. This time, it wasn't my voice on the other end. It wasn't anyone I recognized either. It sounded like a little girl. "Why don't you come play with me?" she said, her voice light and playful, like she was skipping rope or playing hopscotch. I didn't know how to respond. "Don't you remember?" she asked. "No." I stopped mid-sentence. Something about her voice did seem familiar, but I couldn't place it. "Come play with me," she said again, giggling softly. "It's feel like it." You wanted to ask more questions, but the call ended before I could. That night I dreamed about her. Or at least, I think I did. It was one of those dreams that feels too real, where you wake up questioning whether it actually happened. I was standing in a field, surrounded by fog, and in the distance, I could see a small figure skipping toward me. She was holding a jump rope, humming a tune I couldn't recognize. When she got closer, I realized she wasn't a stranger. She was someone I used to know. Her name was Emily, and she lived down the street from me when I was a kid. She used to invite me to play tag or hide and seek after school. But one day, she just stopped showing up. My parents told me her family moved away, but years had died in a house fire. In the dream, she stopped a few feet in front of me and smiled. "Why won't you play with me?" she asked, her voice echoing strangely. Before I could respond, I woke up in a cold sweat. The next day, I felt like a zombie at work. I couldn't focus on anything except the calls, the rules, and what they might mean. Were all of these voices somehow connected to me? And if so, why were they reaching out now? That night, I decided to record the call. I didn't know if it would work. Maybe the number had some kind of supernatural way of blocking recordings, but I had to try. At 10 p.m., the phone rang. "Hello," I said, hitting the record button on my laptop at the same time. This time, the voice on the other end was my sister. "I miss you," she said softly. My sister was alive and well. We just FaceTimed a few days ago. "What do you want?" I asked, trying to stay calm. "You're not listening," she replied, her voice growing fainter. "I am listening," I said, almost shouting. "I've been listening this whole time," she whispered. "Not to us, to yourself." And then the line went dead. When I checked the recording afterward, the file was empty. After the call ended that night, I sat there, staring at the recording software on my laptop, trying to make sense of what had just happened. The fact that the file was empty made my stomach twist. I'd hit record. I watched the little red light blinking the entire time. But when I hit playback, there was nothing, just silence. I didn't know what to do. Part of me wanted to just smash my phone to pieces and be done with it. But the voice from the second call still haunted me. "You bought the number. You opened the door." It didn't feel like I could just walk away from this anymore. The message from the last call stuck with me too. "You're not to us. To yourself." What did that even mean? I was listening. I had been listening to all of them. But now it felt like they were trying to tell me something deeper, something I wasn't understanding. I spent most of the next day trying to piece it together. If this number was a door, like the earlier call had said, then what exactly had I let in? Or what had I let out? That evening, I decided to take a different approach. If the rules were to listen and not let the calls go to voicemail, Then maybe I needed to do more than just listen. Maybe I needed to respond, really engage with them. At exactly 10 p.m., the phone rang again. "Hello," I said, trying to sound calm. This time, the voice was someone I hadn't expected, my old piano teacher, Mrs. Gable. She passed away when I was 16, and I hadn't thought about her in years. But the moment I heard her voice, I was transported back to her living room, sitting on that wobbly piano bench while she gently scolded me for not "Have you been practicing?" She asked, her voice warm but firm, just like I remembered. "Practicing what?" I asked, confused. "What I taught you," she replied. "You remember, don't you?" I hesitated. I hadn't touched a piano in over a decade. "Don't think I do." There was a pause on the other end, and then she said something that made my heart skip a beat. "Then why did you call me?" I didn't. I blurted out. "You know," she said gently, "you called us." The line went dead. After that call, I started noticing other strange things I couldn't explain. For one, my phone started acting weird. Apps would crash for no reason. Text messages I'd sent earlier in the day would randomly disappear from my inbox. Even my wallpaper changed on its own. At first, I thought I was just imagining it, but then I noticed something. The new wallpaper was an image I hadn't seen in years. It was a photo of me as a kid, sitting at Mrs. Gable's piano. I stared at the screen for what felt like hours, trying to remember where that photo had even come from. It wasn't on my phone before. I hadn't uploaded it to any social media. The only place I knew it existed was in an old photo album, buried somewhere in my parents' attic. The next night, I decided to test something. If these calls were really tied to my past, maybe the number was accessing things I'd forgotten, things I hadn't thought about in years. I started going through old boxes in my closet, digging out anything I could find, yearbooks, journals, anything that might connect to the voices I'd been hearing. That's when I found it. At the bottom of a dusty shoebox, I came across an old cassette tape labeled, "For You." I didn't remember ever seeing it before, but my name was written on it in shaky handwriting. There was no date, no explanation, just those two words. I didn't even own a cassette player anymore, so I spent the next hour driving around to thrift stores until I finally found one. When I got home, I popped the tape in and hit play. At first, there was nothing but static. I almost thought it was blank. But then, I heard a faint melody played on a piano. It was the song Miss Gable used to make me practice every week. I'd forgotten all about it until now. The melody played for about a minute before a voice broke through the static. "We've been waiting." It wasn't Mrs. Gable's voice. It wasn't my mom, my grandpa, Noah, or anyone else I recognized. It was a voice, but not quite. It sounded distant, fainter, like it was coming from far away. The tape cut off after that, leaving me sitting there in stunned silence. The call that night felt different. I didn't even wait for the usual 10 p.m. ring. I knocked my feet 9. I unlocked the stared at the screen, waiting for it to light up. When the call came, I answered immediately. "Hello." "You found it," the voice said. "Found what?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "The tape." It replied. "It's part of the door." "What does that mean?" I demanded. "Why is this happening to me? What do you want from me?" The voice didn't answer directly. Instead, it said, "Do you remember the song?" I froze. "You need to play it." The voice continued. "That's the piano," I said automatically, though I wasn't sure why that was my first response. "You'll find one," the voice said simply. And then the call ended. That night, I couldn't sleep. The idea of playing that song, it felt like a trap. but also felt like the only way forward. I didn't know why the number had chosen me or what it wanted, but I was starting to feel like I didn't have a choice. The next day, I drove to my parents' house. They still had the old pride piano in the living room, though it hadn't been tuned in years. When I sat down in front of it, my hands hovered over the keys, hesitant. It had been so long since I'd played. But as soon as I started, it all came flooding back. The melody was simple, repetitive, almost hypnotic. As I played, I felt something strange, a pull, like the song was unlocking something deep inside me. And then, halfway through the song, my phone buzzed. I stopped playing and checked the screen. It wasn't 10 p.m. yet, but the cursed number was calling me. This time I let it ring. The call wasn't supposed to come early. For 8 nights. It had rung at exactly 10 p.m., never a minute before or after. But this time, it was 3:47 p.m. I stared at my phone, unsure whether I should pick it up. This felt different, wrong somehow. But maybe it was because I had started playing the song. I hesitated, but then I remembered the ruleless. Don't let it go to voicemail. I answered. Hello. For a moment, there was no response. Then a voice came through, faint but unmistakable. It was my mom again. What did you stop playing? She asked, her tone soft but disappointed. I didn't think it mattered. I stammered. What's the point of all this? What does the song even do? It's not just a song, Shasek keyed. But you have to finish it. What happens if I don't? I asked, my voice trembling. The line crackled, and for a second, I thought she wasn't going to answer. Then, in a voice so quiet I almost missed it, she said, You'll say, where? I asked, my heart pounding, but the call ended before she could explain. That night, I sat in front of the piano for hours, staring at the keys. I didn't want to finish the song. Something about it felt like crossing a line I couldn't uncross. But if I didn't play it, what would happen? Would I be stuck in this endless cycle of calls forever? At exactly 10 p.m., the phone rang again. I picked it up without hesitation. This time, the voice just said, You ready to finish it? It wasn't my mom this time. It wasn't my grandpa or Noah or anyone else I knew. It was me. Not the same version of me I'd heard in earlier calls. This one sounded distant, like it was coming from the other side of a wall. What does it have to be me? Well, can't you just leave me alone? Because you opened the door, the voice said, echoing the same phrase I'd heard before. And now it's up to you to close it. How? Finish the song, it said simply. What happens if I do? I asked. There was a long pause, and then the voice said something that chilled me to my core. You already know. And then the call ended. I didn't play the song that night, or the next night, or the next or that. The calls kept coming, every single night at 10 p.m., but I stopped answering them. I knew I was breaking the rules, but I didn't care. I couldn't bring myself to finish the song, and I didn't want to know what would happen if I did. At first, nothing changed. The calls would ring for a while and then go to voicemail, just like before. But the voicemails were getting stranger. Instead of voices I recognized, they were filled with faint whispers and odd, rhythmic tapping sounds, almost like someone was playing the piano, but with random notes that didn't make sense. And then, on the 15th night, I noticed something else. When I woke up the next morning, my phone had a notification for a voicemail from the cursed member. That wasn't new. This time, it wasn't just one voicemail. It was dozens. I opened my voicemail inbox and scrolled through the list. Every single one was from the same number, all times stamped at 10 p.m. the night before. There were over 40 then, all marked as unplayed. I hesitated for a long time before finally pressing Play on the first one. At first, it was just static. But then, faintly, I heard the same song Mrs. Gable had taught me. It was being played slowly, one note at a time, like someone was trying to teach it to me all over again. The second voicemail was the same. So was the third, and the fourth. By the time I reached the 10th message, I realized what they were doing. They were playing the song for me, forcing me to finish it, note by note, even if I didn't want to. That night, I sat at the piano again. I didn't answer the call when it came. I didn't even look at my phone. Instead, I placed my hands on the keys and started playing. The melody came easier this time, like I wasn't even thinking about it. My fingers moved on their own, hitting each note with perfect precision. The song built slowly, climbing toward a crescendo I didn't remember ever learning. And then, as I hit the final note, something happened. The room went completely silent. Not just quiet, let the air itself had been sucked out. I couldn't even hear the hum of the fridge in the next room, or the faint buzz of the streetlights outside. And then, I felt it. A presence. I don't know how to describe it, but it felt like I wasn't alone anymore. When I finally looked at my phone, the cursed number was gone. Not just blocked or deleted, it was like it had never been there. My call log was empty, my voicemail inbox was clear, and the contact I had saved as cursed number had disappeared completely. For the first time in weeks, I thought it was over. But then, as I was getting ready for bed, I noticed something on my desk. It was the cassette tape, the same one I'd found in the shoebox, the one I'd played just days ago. But this time, the label was different. Instead of "For You," it now said, "Listening." I haven't touched it since. I don't know if the door is closed or if it's still open. I don't even know what was on the other side, or why the calls started in the first place. All I know is that sometimes, late at night, I hear faint tapping sounds, like piano keys, coming from somewhere in the house. And every time I hear it, I wonder, did I really finish the song, or did it finish me?